Open any history book, and you'll find the same faces staring back. Kings in ermine robes, queens with jeweled crowns, generals on horseback, their names carved into monuments that still stand centuries later. The pages are filled with treaties signed in golden ink, with battles that decided the fate of nations, with marriages that united kingdoms and wars that tore them apart. This is the history we've been taught to remember, a history of thrones and crowns, of power passing from one anointed head to another, of decisions made in marble halls that echo with importance. But here's what those pages don't tell you. For every king whose portrait hangs in a museum, there were 10,000 people whose faces were never painted. For every queen whose letters were preserved in royal archives, there were 100,000 women whose words dissolved into silence. For every nobleman whose lineage was meticulously recorded, there were countless families whose names vanished like breath on a winter morning, leaving no trace that they ever existed at all. Imagine a medieval town at dawn. The castle sits on the hill, exactly where you'd expect it, stone towers catching the first light, banners snapping in the wind, walls thick enough to withstand any siege. Your eye is drawn there naturally, because that's where power lives, where history is supposedly made. But let your gaze drift downward, down the hillside, down to the narrow streets below, where the real town wakes. Smoke begins to rise, not from one chimney, but from hundreds. Thin grey columns lifting into the pale sky from houses you can barely see, from roofs made of thatch and wood, from walls built with mud and prayer. Behind each of those rising threads of smoke, there's a fire being coaxed back to life. There are hands working in darkness. There are people whose names will never appear in any chronicle, whose lives will leave no record except perhaps a single line in a parish register: born, married, died. This is where the story really lives. Not in the throne room, but in the kitchen where bread is kneaded before sunrise. Not in the great hall, but in the workshop where a craftsman shapes iron that will outlast his own bones. Not in the castle, but in the field where someone bends to the earth, planting seeds they may not live to harvest. History remembers the crown but forgets the hands that forged it. It remembers the castle, but forgets who laid each stone. It remembers the feast, but forgets who cooked the meal, who served the wine, who scrubbed the plates clean long after the nobles had staggered off to bed. The story we've been told is incomplete. Not wrong exactly, but missing something essential, missing the vast majority of human experience, missing the ordinary magic of daily survival, missing the truth that civilization was built not by the few who commanded, but by the many who labored. What you're about to hear isn't a story of kings and conquests. There will be no dramatic sword fights, no political intrigue, no romance between princes and princesses. This is something quieter, something deeper. This is the story of how people actually lived when the history books weren't watching, how they woke in the cold darkness, how they made fire from nothing, how they fed themselves and their children when hunger was a constant companion, how they found meaning in days that must have felt endless, in labor that must have felt crushing, in lives that seemed to matter to no one but themselves. But here's the thing, those lives mattered completely. Every single one. And if we're quiet enough, if we listen carefully enough, we can still hear them. Not in the grand proclamations of kings, but in the whisper of wind through a thatched roof, in the scrape of a wooden spoon against a pot, in the rhythm of a scythe cutting grain. The echoes are faint now, separated from us by centuries of silence. But they're there, and they're waiting to be heard. The world beneath the castle wasn't flat. It had layers, levels, gradations so subtle that an outsider might miss them entirely, yet so important that everyone who lived within the system could read them instantly. A glance at someone's shoes, the fabric of their sleeve, the way they held themselves when speaking to a stranger. These weren't nobles and peasants facing each other across an unbridgeable divide. This was something more complex, more human. A pyramid built not of stone but of necessity and ambition, and small dignities carefully guarded. Let's follow something simple to see how this worked. A copper coin, hardly worth mentioning in the great chronicles. Yet this single piece of metal will show us more about how society actually functioned than a dozen royal decrees. Watch where it goes. The coin falls first from the pocket of a merchant's wife as she runs her fingers across silk fabric in the marketplace. She doesn't even notice its loss. Her husband trades in wool and wheat, moves goods along rivers and roads, accumulates gold the way others accumulate calluses. They'll never be noble that door is closed, no matter how much wealth they gather, but they live well. Their home has glass in the windows. Their children will inherit something. The coin means nothing to her, and she walks away, still feeling the silk, calculating whether the price is fair. A servant girl finds the coin an hour later, half buried in the mud between stalls. Her eyes light up in a way the merchant's wife would never understand. This girl works in a household not unlike the merchant's, scrubbing floors and hauling water from dawn until long after dark. She sleeps in a corner of the kitchen. She owns 2 dresses, both patched. This coin represents something specific and immediate. A loaf of bread she won't have to beg from the kitchen stores. She clutches it tight and heads toward the baker's stall. The baker takes the coin and gives her the bread without really looking at her. He's a guild member, a master of his craft, and he knows exactly where he stands in the world. Above the servant girl, certainly. Below the merchant's wife, obviously. But he has something they don't, a skill that took years to master. A reputation that extends beyond his own street, a place in the guild that gives him protection and pride. His hands are flour white. His back aches from the heat of the oven. But when he walks through town, other craftsmen nod to him as an equal. The coin goes into his pouch with a dozen others just like it. By evening, the baker gives that same coin as change to a carpenter who's buying rolls for his supper. The carpenter is younger, still learning, not yet a master of his trade, but no longer an apprentice either. He's in that uncertain middle place, skilled enough to be trusted with real work, not established enough to set his own terms. He lives in a rented room. He saves what he can. He hopes that someday he'll have his own workshop, his own apprentices. But tonight, he loses the coin in a dice game behind a tavern, and his stomach twists with regret because he needed that money, needed it in a way the merchant's wife never needed anything. The man who wins the coin at dice is a day labourer whose muscles built the cathedral on the square, though he'll never be buried within its walls. He has no guild to protect him, no special skill to sell, only his back and his arms and his willingness to work until his body gives out. He wakes each morning not knowing if there will be work, and he goes to sleep each night knowing that injury or illness would mean destitution. The coin will buy him ale, which will help him sleep despite the pain in his shoulders. He drops the coin in the mud while stumbling home drunk, and a child finds it the next morning. A beggar child, thin as a shadow, who exists at the very bottom of the pyramid, below even those who labour. This child has no family, no home, no prospects. Just survival, measured day by day, meal by stolen meal. The coin might buy food. It might be stolen by an older, stronger child. It might be the difference between living and dying, though no one will record which. A single coin could buy a meal or save a life, depending on whose pocket it fell into. The pyramid had many levels, and each level contained an entire world. Its own rules, its own hopes, its own particular flavour of struggle. The view from each level looked different, but everyone was climbing, or trying not to fall, and the coin kept moving, hand to hand, carrying with it the invisible weight of all their separate dreams. Walk toward a common dwelling on any morning in the world we're describing, and your senses know you're approaching long before your eyes confirm it. The smell reaches you first wood smoke, thick and ever-present, mixing with the earthier scent of animals and the sharp tang of human life lived in close quarters. Then, the sounds. Chickens scratching and muttering in the yard, maybe a goat bleating, the creak of a door that's been hung and rehung a dozen times, and finally, the sight itself. Walls the colour of dried mud, because that's exactly what they are, a roof of bundled straw darkened by weather and time. Patches visible everywhere, like scars on skin, showing where repairs have been made and made again. These houses weren't built and then left alone. They were more like living things, requiring constant attention, constant care. The walls were wattle and daub, a frame of woven sticks plastered over with mud mixed with straw, animal dung, sometimes animal hair. It sounds crude when you say it plainly like that, but there was real knowledge in knowing the right consistency, the right mixture, the right technique to make walls that would stand through winter storms and summer heat. You learned by watching your father, who learned from his father, who learned from his. The knowledge lived in hands, not books. Those walls cracked. They always cracked. Rain found its way in. Wind discovered gaps that hadn't existed the season before. So you patched them. You mixed fresh daub and pressed it into the cracks with your fingers, smoothing it as best you could, knowing it would crack again eventually, but doing it anyway because that's what you did. That's what keeping a house meant, this endless conversation with decay, this quiet battle against weather and time that you could never quite win but couldn't afford to lose. The roof above was thatch, layers of bundled straw or reed stacked and tied in overlapping rows. A good thatch job, done by someone who knew the craft, could last 20 years. A poor one might fail in 2. You could read a family's situation in their roof. Was it thick and even, or thin and patchy? Had it been recently replaced, or was it sagging in the middle, letting rain drip through into the living space below? Thatch wasn't just practical. It was insulation, keeping heat in during winter, keeping the worst of summer's heat out. But it harboured mice and insects, and it could catch fire if a spark from the hearth drifted up at the wrong angle. People died that way, burned alive in homes that went up like tinder. Inside, the floor was packed earth. Some families had the resources to lay stone, or at least flat pieces of wood, but most walked on dirt that had been compressed by generations of footsteps until it was nearly as hard as stone anyway. In winter, you might spread rushes or straw over it for a little warmth, a little softness. In summer, you swept it clean and lived with the dust. The space itself was small. 1 room, maybe 2 if the family had done well, and that space served every purpose: cooking, eating, working, sleeping, being born, dying. If you were fortunate, you had a separate room or lean-to where animals sheltered. If not, the goat or pig or chickens shared your space, their body heat a mixed blessing on cold nights. You learned to sleep despite the sounds, despite the smells. You learned not to notice, or at least to accept that this was how things were. Some homes had a loft, a sleeping platform built above the main space, reached by a ladder. Children might sleep there, or it served as storage for whatever needed to be kept dry. The better homes had a proper hearth built of stone. The poorer ones just had a fire pit in the centre of the floor, smoke rising to find its way out through a hole in the roof or simply seeping through the thatch itself, leaving everything inside coated with a fine layer of soot. The walls were made of mud and straw, yet within them, entire universes unfolded. A house that your grandfather built, that your father maintained, that you now kept standing, that was legacy. That was permanence. It might not look like much to an outsider's eye, but it was yours. It was shelter. It was the place where your children were born, and where, if fortune held, you would die surrounded by family rather than alone in a ditch. These crude structures were more than buildings. They were promises kept against impossible odds, monuments to the stubborn human insistence that we deserve a roof over our heads, walls around us, a hearth to gather at when darkness falls. Darkness was absolute. Not the darkness you know, filtered through streetlights and the glow of distant cities, but true darkness, thick, complete, pressing against your closed eyelids like a physical weight. In a cottage with no windows, or only tiny openings shuttered tight against the cold, night meant blindness. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. You couldn't see the person sleeping beside you, though you could hear their breathing, feel their warmth, know they were there by everything except sight. Sleep in such darkness wasn't the isolated private thing it is now. A family lay together in a single room, sometimes a single bed if they had one, or on straw mattresses arranged on the floor, covered with whatever they owned, wool blankets thin from use, old clothing layered for warmth, animal skins if fortune had provided them, bodies pressed close, sharing heat, sharing breath, children nestled between adults. Sometimes even the family's livestock remained nearby, their larger bodies radiating warmth that made the difference between sleeping and shivering through the night. Waking came gradually, not with the violence of an alarm, but with the slow return of consciousness. Maybe the rooster called from somewhere outside. Maybe your bladder demanded attention. Maybe it was simply that your body knew, after a lifetime of rising at the same dark hour, that the time had come. You didn't leap from bed. The air beyond the blankets was cold, genuinely cold in a way that modern heated homes have taught us to forget. So you lay there a moment longer, gathering yourself, preparing to leave the warmth of sleep and body heat for the shock of cold air on skin. The first person to rise was usually the woman of the household, not because of any natural law, but because someone had to, and this was the task that had fallen to her as surely as ploughing fell to her husband. She would move slowly in the complete darkness, hands reaching out, feeling her way across familiar space. Every object in that room had a place she knew by heart. The rough texture of the wall, the post that held up the roof beam, the cold stone of the hearth. Before the sun rose, before the rooster called, there was the quiet ritual of summoning fire from ash. This was the first and most important task of each day, more critical than any other because everything else depended on it. Fire meant light, warmth, the ability to cook food, to see, to live. Without it, the day couldn't properly begin. The hearth held last night's fire, or what remained of it. Before sleep, someone would have carefully buried the living embers under a layer of ash, preserving them through the night like a secret kept safe. Now, in the darkness, hands would brush away that ash with practiced care, searching for the faint heat that meant the fire still lived. Sometimes you found it a glow so dim you could barely see it, but real, precious, salvageable. Sometimes you found only cold ash, and then the work became harder, requiring flint and steel, requiring patience and skill and luck. But let's say the embers were there. You'd arrange the tinder, carefully dried grass, bark, small twigs, whatever caught easily. You'd blow on the embers, gently at first, then with more force, watching as the glow brightened. This was a conversation with fire. A negotiation. Too much air too fast and you'd scatter the embers. Too little and they'd die back into darkness. You learned the right rhythm. You learned to read the colour of the glow, to understand when to add slightly larger sticks, when to hold back and let the flame establish itself. And then, if you did everything right, the miracle occurred. A tiny flame appeared, barely there at first, yellow and fragile, but growing. Fed carefully, protected from drafts, that single flame would spread from tinder to kindling to larger wood, and slowly, gradually, the darkness would retreat, not quickly, not all at once. But in expanding circles, light pushed back the night, and the room emerged from invisibility. Faces became visible. The familiar objects of daily life materialized. The day, tentatively, began to exist. This happened every morning, in countless homes, performed by countless hands. The ritual of making fire from almost nothing, of calling light out of darkness, of proving once again that human knowledge and human persistence could push back the cold and the dark for another day. It was so ordinary that no one thought to record it, so essential that life couldn't exist without it, and so ancient that your ancestors had performed exactly this ritual, in exactly this way, for longer than any written history could remember. The fire caught, the flames grew, and in that growing light, the day's true work could finally begin. Hunger had a presence in that house, not always overwhelming, not always demanding immediate attention, but always there, like a third party in every conversation, a silent observer of every decision. You woke with it, you worked with it, you went to sleep with it, a familiar hollow ache that you'd learned to interpret serious or manageable, urgent or merely persistent. For most people, for most of history, this was simply the normal state of being human. A full belly was not a right but a hope, renewed or deferred with each sunrise. The food that sustained the family lived in a wooden chest near the wall, kept off the ground to discourage rats, though rats always found their way in eventually. Grain, mostly, barley or oats or rye, depending on the region and what grew reliably in local soil. This grain was measured carefully because it had to last until the next harvest, months away, and there was no store to visit if you ran out. Every scoop removed from that chest represented a calculation. How many mouths today? How much remains? How long until we can replenish this supply? If fortune smiled, there might be other stores. A piece of salted pork hanging from a rafter, its surface white with crystallized salt. The meat transformed into something that could survive weeks without spoiling. Dried peas or beans in a sack. Root vegetables buried in sand or stored in a cool place where they wouldn't rot too quickly. Maybe some preserved fruit, though that was a luxury many families never saw. Each item in these stores represented labor, already expended: the planting, the tending, the harvesting, the preserving. Looking at these stores meant seeing the physical manifestation of months of work and seeing how quickly it would disappear into hungry mouths. The morning meal was pottage, almost always pottage. A pot hung over the fire, water added, grain measured in and stirred as it heated. The grain would soften and swell, absorbing the water, becoming something warm and filling, if not exactly satisfying. If there were vegetables, an onion, some cabbage, a turnip, they might go in. If there was any fat, any meat, any bone to give flavour, it would be added, though such additions were special occasions, not daily expectations. The pot bubbled. The smell filled the small room. Stomachs tightened in anticipation. The woman ladled it out, and this was where you saw the true economy of the household laid bare. Who received their portion first? Whose bowl held slightly more? The father, because he would work hardest in the fields and needed fuel for his muscles. The older children, because they too would labour. The mother, taking less than she needed because someone had to. The youngest children, their portions carefully measured because growing bodies needed sustenance, but also because there was only so much to go around. Everyone watched the ladle, not with hostility but with the careful attention that comes from knowing that fairness mattered, that resentment over unequal portions could poison a household faster than spoiled grain. No one ate until they were full. That sensation of genuine satiation, of having enough and then some, was a rare gift, experienced perhaps a few times a year at festivals or after a particularly good harvest. The normal state was eating until the hunger dulled to something bearable, then stopping because the food had to last, because tomorrow would bring the same hunger, and the day after that, and the day after that. Families develop strategies for managing scarcity that sound paranoid until you understand the stakes. Never keep all your grain in one place, because fire or theft or spoilage could destroy everything. Maintain good relations with neighbours, because in a desperate season they might share when you had nothing, and you would do the same when your positions reversed. Know which plants growing wild near the village were edible, which roots could be dug in an emergency, which leaves could stretch a pot of pottage when supplies ran lowest. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was taught through necessity, passed from parents who had survived lean times to children who would face their own. The diet changed with the seasons in ways we struggle to imagine now. In late summer and early autumn after harvest, there might be abundance, fresh vegetables, grain that hadn't yet been rationed into careful portions, perhaps meat from animals slaughtered before winter. But as winter deepened and then dragged into spring, the stores dwindled. The hungry months arrived, that terrible period when last year's harvest was nearly exhausted and this year's crops were still weeks from maturity. During those months, people grew thinner. Faces became gaunt. Work became harder because bodies had less fuel. The very young and very old were most vulnerable, their bodies less able to withstand prolonged scarcity. And then, if fortune held, if the weather cooperated, if the seeds sprouted and the rains came at the right times, harvest arrived again. The cycle renewed, the stores refilled. The gnawing companion of hunger retreated slightly, never disappearing entirely but becoming manageable again, until the next hungry months. Until the next test of whatever you'd managed to preserve and ration and protect against the inevitable day when the chest was nearly empty and spring seemed impossibly far away. Time moved differently then. Not slower exactly, but along a different axis entirely. There were no clocks ticking on walls, no phones displaying precise minutes and seconds, no schedules dividing the day into measured units. Time was something you read in the world around you, the angle of sunlight falling through the door, the length of your shadow on the ground, the position of the sun in its arc across the sky. Church bells rang in towns and villages, marking the hours for prayer, giving structure to those who lived within hearing. But for most people, time was task and season, not number and increment. The farmer left his house as soon as light permitted, walking toward fields that might be distant enough that the journey itself consumed a significant portion of the morning. He carried tools whose weight he no longer consciously noticed: a scythe, a hoe, a sickle, implements worn smooth by decades of hands before his. As he walked, his mind was already working through the day ahead. The field needed weeding, the ditch wanted clearing. The fence at the far edge had weakened and would fail completely if not repaired. He wouldn't think, "I have 8 hours to work." He would think, "I must finish the weeding before the sun makes it unbearable, and if time remains, I'll start on that fence." Time was not counted in hours but in tasks completed, seeds planted, lengths of furrow turned and ready. In the town, a craftsman opened his workshop to the morning light. Perhaps he was a carpenter, inheriting not just his father's tools but his father's name, his father's reputation, his father's place in the guild that regulated the craft. The project before him, a chest commissioned by a merchant, or repairs to a cartwheel, or the framing for a new building, existed as a series of stages rather than a deadline in days or weeks. First, the wood must be selected, each piece examined for flaws, for grain, for the particular properties that made it suitable or unsuitable. Then the cutting, the shaping, the joining. Each stage completed in its own time, rushed only at the cost of quality, and quality was everything. Your name was attached to your work. Your children would inherit your reputation. A chest poorly made didn't just lose you one customer, it damaged the family legacy, the standing you held among fellow craftsmen, the pride that was often the only wealth you'd ever accumulate. The woman's work followed a different rhythm entirely, one without clear beginning or end, only constant circulation through necessary tasks. Water needed fetching, and the well or stream wasn't conveniently located. It meant walking, carrying, returning with weight that made shoulders ache. The garden required tending, because the vegetables growing there represented survival, not hobby. Weeds didn't rest, and neither could she. Children needed watching, feeding, teaching, correcting, and always there was spinning. Wool processed into thread that would become cloth that would become clothing or blankets or trade goods. The spindle turned in her hands while she walked, while she talked, while she supervised children, while she waited for water to boil. This work had no completion point. Finish one thread and immediately begin another. Finish one task and 3 more waited. Her day was a loop, each revolution bringing her back to tasks that were never truly finished, only maintained. Work was identity in a way we struggle to understand. A man wasn't someone who happened to work with barrels, he was Cooper. And coopering was what gave him standing, what connected him to his lineage, what defined his place in the world. A woman wasn't someone who occasionally baked, she was the baker's wife, or the brewer's daughter, or in rare cases, the baker herself. And that identification carried with it expectations, relationships, a web of connections that structured social life. But work was also communal, in ways that seem strange now. When harvest time arrived, neighbours helped neighbours, because next week your positions might reverse, because the work was too much for one family, because that's simply what was done. The wealthy might hire labourers, but most people operated in networks of reciprocal obligation. I help you bring in your wheat. You help me repair my roof. He helps both of us when the common pasture fence needs mending. These weren't transactions recorded in ledgers, but debts remembered in minds. Obligations that structured community life as firmly as any written contract. Guilds regulated craft work, but not only as restrictions. They were protection, identity, and insurance. If you fell ill, the guild might provide support. If you died, they might help your widow continue the business. If someone outside the guild tried to undercut prices or produce inferior work, the guild defended standards and livelihoods. You belonged to something larger than yourself, and that belonging came with both constraints and securities. The sun climbed, work continued, muscles found their rhythm. Hands performed motions they'd performed thousands of times before, actions so ingrained they required no conscious thought. A scythe swinging through grain, a hammer striking hot iron, a needle pulling thread through fabric. The day wasn't measured by clock hands circling, but by progress, visible, tangible, real. And when the sun reached its highest point, when shadows pooled directly beneath things, when the heat peaked, then only then did the rhythm briefly pause. Time for a meal, time to rest before the afternoon's labour stretched toward evening. The light changed first. Morning's angled rays, which had painted everything in long shadows and gave the world depth and definition, gradually shifted until the sun stood nearly overhead. Shadows that had stretched across fields and streets began to contract, pulling inward, pooling directly beneath the objects that cast them. A person's shadow became a small dark stain at their feet. Trees offered circles of shade instead of long protective corridors. The quality of illumination turned harsh, flat, revealing every detail with unforgiving clarity. Heat followed, especially in the warmer months. Not the gentle warmth of morning, but something heavier, more oppressive, pressing down from above and radiating up from sun-baked earth and stone. The air itself seemed to thicken. Birds that had been vocal all morning grew silent, seeking shelter in whatever shade they could find. Even insects slowed their frantic buzzing. The world briefly held still, as if the sun's dominance demanded submission from everything beneath it. For people working in fields, this was the signal to pause. Not because anyone ordered it, not because a bell rang or a schedule dictated, but because the body demanded it, and the sun permitted no argument. The farmer who had been working since dawn would straighten his back with audible relief, feeling vertebrae realign, feeling the protest of muscles that had been bent to repetitive motion for hours. He'd walk to the edge of his field where a tree offered shade, or simply sit on the ground if no shade existed, accepting the sun's heat as unavoidable. From a cloth bundle he'd extract his midday food bread, probably hard and dark. Maybe cheese if he'd had it, an onion eaten raw, water from a skin that was warm from the sun but still wet, still drinkable. In the town, craftsmen emerged from workshops into doorways or streets, squinting in the brightness after hours of working in dimmer interiors. They'd stand or sit, eating food similar to what the farmer ate, watching the street's activity slow to match their own pause. A master craftsman and his journeyman might sit near each other, the usual distance between their stations temporarily collapsed by shared rest. They ate similar food. Their exhaustion was similar. In the brief pause when shadows disappeared beneath their casters, even the hierarchy of the world seemed to hold its breath. Women working in houses had a different relationship with midday. For them, this was the brightest light they'd see all day, and certain tasks demanded good light, mending clothes with careful stitches, sorting grain to remove stones and spoiled kernels, any detailed work that strained the eyes in dimmer conditions. So while men rested from physical exertion, women often worked through midday, taking advantage of illumination that wouldn't last. But they too would eat, often standing, often while simultaneously watching children or tending to some other task that couldn't be postponed. The food at midday was rarely elaborate. This wasn't a feast or even a proper meal in the sense we'd recognize. It was fuel, practical and simple, eaten not for pleasure but because the body required it to continue functioning through afternoon's labor. Bread and water were the foundation. Bread that you'd baked yourself, or that your wife had baked, or that you'd bought from the baker if you had the coin and lived where such purchase was possible. The bread was often days old, hard enough that you might soften it in water or ale before eating. It filled the stomach. It provided energy. That was sufficient. Yet there was something almost ritualistic about this pause, this shared stopping. All across the village or town, work slowed simultaneously. Not because anyone coordinated it, but because everyone read the same signs, the sun's position, the heat's intensity, the body's needs. In fields and workshops and homes, people ate. Not together in the sense of gathering around a common table, but together in time, in shared experience, in the quiet acknowledgement that human bodies have limits, and the day's work is long enough, that stopping briefly makes it possible to continue. The conversation, when it happened, was sparse. Men might exchange a few words about the work, about what remained to be done, about weather or crops or some practical concern. Women might speak about children, about a neighbour's illness, about something that needed addressing. But often there was just silence, the comfortable quiet of people too tired to make unnecessary noise, resting in proximity to each other, that proximity itself a form of connection even without words. This was midday, liminal, suspended between morning's relative freshness and afternoon's long grind toward evening. Neither truly rest nor truly work, but a threshold between them. A moment when the world paused, when labour ceased being urgent, when even hunger was briefly satisfied, and when the simple act of sitting in whatever shade you could find felt like a small mercy granted by a sun that gave no other concessions. Most people couldn't read. Not the Bible, not contracts, not even their own names written on parchment. Literacy was a specialized skill, possessed by clergy and scribes, and the occasional wealthy merchant who'd paid for education. For everyone else, communication happened through speech, through gesture, through the complex vocabulary of bodies in space and hands in motion. You learned to read people instead of pages, and that reading was often more reliable. Watch a marketplace on any ordinary day, and you'd see a choreography as intricate as any court dance, though no one would have called it that. A farmer arriving with goods to sell wouldn't approach a potential buyer directly with aggressive enthusiasm. He'd position himself, arrange his produce, and wait. Eye contact would be made brief, assessing. A nod might follow, permission to approach. Or eyes would slide away, a clear signal that no interest existed. All this happened without words, without offence given or taken, because everyone understood the language being spoken. Status shaped every interaction, visible in 1,000 small ways. How close you stood to someone, whether you removed your hat, whether you spoke first or waited to be addressed. A labourer greeting a master craftsman would lower his eyes slightly, not in servile cowering, but in acknowledgement of social position. The craftsman might nod in return, or not, depending on mood. and whether he wished to acknowledge the greeting. These weren't cruelties, they were the grammar of social life, rules everyone knew and mostly accepted because structure gave order to a world that could quickly descend into chaos. Physical touch carried meaning that varied precisely with context. A handshake between men of similar status sealed agreements as binding as any written contract. Words were wind, but a handshake sealed fate. In a world without contracts, trust was built in flesh and witnessed by eyes. The witnesses mattered almost as much as the agreement itself, because memory was the record-keeping system, and disputes would be settled by asking those who had seen the original exchange. Two men clasping hands while others watched, that was law, that was binding. That was how business operated when parchment was expensive, and most people couldn't read it anyway. Honor existed at every level of society, not just among nobles with their elaborate codes of conduct. A common woman's reputation for virtue was currency she guarded carefully, because once lost, it couldn't be recovered. A man's reputation for honest dealing meant the difference between prosperity and suspicion. A family known for keeping their word could borrow grain in hard times and be trusted to repay. A family with a reputation for dishonesty might starve, even while neighbors had surplus, because trust was everything, and trust, once broken, was nearly impossible to repair. Disputes happened, as they always do when humans live in proximity. But resolution didn't involve courts. In most cases, courts were expensive, distant, operated in languages common people didn't speak. Instead, disputes went to people respected within the community. The village elder whose judgment was trusted, the guildmaster who understood the particulars of craft disagreements. These mediators listened, weighed evidence that consisted mostly of testimony and reputation, and rendered decisions that carried weight because everyone had agreed, implicitly, to abide by them. An apology was a public act, witnessed, acknowledged with specific words and gestures that everyone recognized as genuine or false. News traveled by mouth. An event in one town would be carried by travelers to the next, told and retold, changing slightly with each telling, but maintaining its essential truth or its essential falsehood, if that's what was being propagated. Rumor and fact blended, because there was no way to verify claims except through repetition and the reputation of the teller. A known liar's news was discounted. A trusted person's word was accepted. The medium was inseparable from the message. Stories preserved what written history couldn't or wouldn't record. Songs carried the deeds of local heroes, the lessons learned from past disasters, the values the community held dear. A good storyteller held power in these communities, not the power of wealth or position, but the power of memory, of entertainment, of shaping how people understood their own past and identity. On long winter nights, when work was impossible and darkness came early, stories filled the hours. Children learned their heritage not from books, but from voices speaking in firelit rooms. The same stories their grandparents had heard from their grandparents, variations accumulating like layers of sediment, but the core remaining recognizable across generations. Everything important happened face to face. Agreements, disputes, courtships, friendships, feuds all required physical presence, required looking into eyes, reading faces, interpreting tones of voice and positions of bodies. There was no hiding behind written messages, no ghosting, no blocking. You lived among the people you dealt with. You'd see them again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. This enforced a certain accountability, a certain carefulness in how you treated others, because reputation was built through a lifetime of small interactions and could be destroyed by a single significant betrayal. Every village, every town, had its geography of shared life places where private existence spilled into public space, where individual concerns met communal needs, where the boundaries between yours and mine became deliberately blurred. These weren't just locations, they were stages where daily theatre unfolded, where relationships were maintained or damaged, where the community performed its constant negotiation between cooperation and conflict. The well stood at the centre of many villages, though centre was often more social than geographical. Water doesn't care about convenience, and wells exist where water can be found. So people adapted their lives to the well's location rather than the reverse. Women made this journey multiple times each day, carrying empty buckets on the way there, full buckets on the return. The weight of water genuinely heavy, arm-straining heavy, meant this was serious labor, not a casual errand. But the well was never just about water. It was an information exchange, a gathering point, a place where you encountered neighbors whether you wanted to or not. A woman approaching the well would assess who was already there, and that assessment would determine her approach. Friends meant lingering, meant conversation while buckets filled, meant the exchange of news both significant and trivial. Rivals meant cool politeness, brief acknowledgement, quick departure. Social hierarchy played out even here, who stepped aside to let another draw water first, whose conversation dominated, who was included in discussions, and who was subtly excluded. News travelled through the well like water through the ground beneath it. A birth, a death, an illness, a dispute, a scandal, all of it moved from house to house via the women who gathered there daily. This wasn't gossip in the dismissive sense we use now. This was how communities maintained awareness of themselves, how needs were identified, how help was organized, how social bonds were either strengthened or frayed. You learned whose husband was looking for work, whose child was sick, whose mother-in-law was dying, whose crop had failed. And you filed that information away because tomorrow or next week or next month, you might need to act on it, or it might affect you, or you might need similar information shared about your own household. The marketplace operated on a different rhythm, less daily than the well, more formal in its organization. Market days varied by region, weekly in some places, monthly in others, timed to allow farmers to bring produce and craftspeople to display goods. The market square transformed on these days from empty space to dense theatre of exchange. Stalls appeared, arranged according to tradition, and sometimes bitter negotiation about who got the most visible positions. A farmer's vegetables, a potter's bowls, a weaver's cloth, a smith's tools, each vendor hoping for buyers, each buyer hoping for fair prices. But commerce was only the surface drama. Beneath it ran other currents. Young people conducted courtships under the pretense of examining goods, chaperoned but granted slightly more freedom than home would allow. A young man might linger near a stall where a young woman helped her mother, asking unnecessary questions about the quality of turnips, his real interest obvious to everyone except, supposedly, himself. Rivalries between vendors expressed themselves through the quality of their goods, their verbal skills at attracting buyers, the rumors they might quietly spread about competitors. Alliances formed through credit extended a buyer allowed to defer payment, a vendor giving slightly better price to someone he hoped to cultivate as steady customer. The commons represented something different again, land that belonged to no one and everyone simultaneously. Common pasture where villagers could graze their animals, forests where certain gathering rights existed, paths that anyone could travel. These spaces operated according to unwritten codes that everyone understood, because survival depended on understanding them. You could graze 2 cows on the common pasture, or 3 sheep, or whatever number had been determined by tradition to be your household's fair share. Exceed that limit, and you'd face social censure, maybe formal penalties imposed by village leadership. Gather deadwood from the forest for your fire, but don't cut living trees, those belonged to whoever held official ownership. And poaching would bring harsh punishment. The well, the market square, the common pasture, these were the stages where a village performed its daily theatre of cooperation and conflict. These spaces forced interaction across social boundaries that homes and private property otherwise reinforced. The wealthy and the poor both needed water. The craftsman and the labourer both had goods to buy or sell. The farmer with many animals and the farmer with few both needed pasture. So these spaces became neutral ground where negotiation was constant, where community cohesion was tested and reaffirmed, where the balance between individual interest and collective good was worked out not through abstract principle, but through daily practice, daily friction, daily adjustment. You couldn't avoid these spaces. You couldn't avoid the people you met there. And so you learned to navigate them, to read their unwritten rules, to participate in the endless dance of community life. Or you found yourself increasingly isolated, increasingly vulnerable, increasingly outside the web of mutual obligation that made survival possible. Everything came from the land. The bread you ate, the ale you drank, the wool on your back, the straw in your roof, all of it traced back to someone bending over earth, coaxing life from soil, fighting the endless battle against weather and pest and blight. Even people who lived in towns, who worked with their hands at crafts or trade, depended absolutely on those who farmed. If the harvest failed, everyone starved. If the harvest succeeded, everyone survived another year. That simple equation structured all of human civilization, and most people lived on the farming side of it. The afternoon stretched long for the farmer in his field. Morning's relative coolness had burned away. The sun pressed down with weight that felt almost solid. Sweat soaked through clothing, attracting flies, creating constant irritation that had to be ignored, because stopping to swat at insects meant stopping work, and work couldn't stop. Not if the field was to be cleared, the crop harvested, the season's narrow window of opportunity exploited before weather turned, or the grain spoiled in the stalk. Consider the act of scything grain. A scythe is a simple tool, a long curved blade attached to a wooden handle, requiring no elaborate mechanism, no complex understanding. But using it effectively requires a knowledge that lives in the body, not the mind. The swing must be smooth, low, cutting the stalks near the ground without catching the blade in earth. The step must time with the swing move forward as the blade sweeps, creating rhythm, covering ground steadily. The angle must adjust constantly based on the density of the grain, the slight variations in ground level, the feedback traveling up the handle into hands that learn to read these vibrations like language. Each swing of the scythe was a conversation with necessity. The field would feed you or starve you, depending on answers you could only partially control. You couldn't make rainfall when drought cracked the earth. You couldn't stop frost from blackening tender shoots. You couldn't prevent the blight that turned healthy wheat into blackened stalks of useless rot. But you could work. You could plant at the right time, in the right way. You could weed and tend and guard against what threats you could address. And when harvest came, you could work until your body screamed for rest, because the grain wouldn't wait for your comfort. The rhythm of scything became meditative after hours of repetition. Swing, step, the motion so ingrained that conscious thought wasn't required. Your mind could drift while your body continued its pattern. You'd think about other things, what needed doing tomorrow, the leak in the roof that wanted fixing, whether your daughter's cough was serious or would pass on its own. Or you'd think about nothing at all, existing purely in the physical sensation of motion, the burn in shoulders and back, the particular ache that came from repeating the same movement hundreds, thousands of times. A farmer read land the way a priest read scripture, with attention developed over years, with understanding that couldn't be taught from books because it lived in observation, in pattern recognition, in knowledge accumulated across seasons. The colour of soil told you its richness, its drainage, what crops would thrive or struggle. The height and vigour of growing plants told stories about water, about nutrients, about the invisible life in earth itself. Birds and insects were indicators certain pests meant certain problems. Predators following prey meant the balance was holding. Absence of birdsong might mean poison or disease. But knowledge couldn't guarantee success. Farming was fundamentally an exercise in managing uncontrollable variables. You did everything right, and still the rain didn't come, or came too much, drowning roots, rotting grain before it could be harvested. A late frost killed the fruit blossoms your trees had spent weeks producing. Locusts appeared like a biblical plague and devoured everything in sight. Blight spread through your field, turning your labour and hope into nothing but blackened stalks and the prospect of hunger. The anxiety lived quietly beneath the surface of every farmer's mind. You didn't speak of it constantly, what good would that do? But it was there. The knowledge that your family's survival depended on factors you couldn't control, that months of back-breaking work could be undone in a single night of unexpected weather, that you were always one bad season away from destitution. This anxiety shaped how you thought, how you planned, how you prayed. It was the weight you carried along with the physical tools of your trade. Yet there were satisfactions. Walking through a field of healthy grain, seeing the heads heavy with seed, knowing that your work had contributed to this abundance that provided genuine pride. Ploughing a straight furrow, each pass parallel to the last. Covering the field in neat rows that showed skill and care that mattered, even though no one would remember or record it. The deep physical exhaustion that came at day's end, muscles trembling, body demanding rest that brought the kind of sleep that needed no assistance, no quieting of worried mind, just the simple shutdown of a body that had worked to its limit. The field stretched ahead, still requiring hours of labor before darkness made work impossible. The scythe swung. The grain fell. The sun moved across the sky in its eternal arc. And somewhere in the village, other people performed other essential labors, different in specifics, but similar in their ultimate purpose: survival. Continuing, lasting one more day, one more season, one more generation. The blacksmith's workshop in afternoon held a particular quality of heat and light. Not the diffuse warmth of sun, but concentrated fire, the forge glowing like a captive sun, radiating waves that made the air shimmer and sweat spring instantly on exposed skin. The smith stood before this controlled inferno, iron gripped in tongs, watching the metal's color change as temperature climbed. Grey to red to orange to yellow-white. Each shade telling him something essential about the metal's state, about when to pull it from flame and place it on anvil and begin the shaping. The hammer rose and fell with deliberate rhythm. Not wild swinging, but measured strikes, each blow placed with intention, each impact moving metal incrementally closer to the desired form. An apprentice worked the bellows, pumping air into the forge, maintaining temperature, learning through repetition when more air was needed and when the fire was hot enough. The master and apprentice formed a unit, their actions coordinated without constant verbal instruction, communication happening through rhythm and observation, and the shared understanding that develops when people work together day after day, year after year. But smithing was only one craft among dozens that kept communities functioning. In another workshop, a weaver sat before a loom, shuttle passing back and forth through the warp threads, building cloth line by line. The work was repetitive, demanding sustained attention because a mistake meant unraveling hours of progress. Her eyes strained in the workshop's dim light, tracking threads, watching for breaks or irregularities, maintaining the tension that kept cloth even and strong. The shuttle's passage made a particular sound, rhythmic and almost musical, punctuating the afternoon like a pulse. Elsewhere, a potter-shaped clay on a wheel, hands wet, feeling the material respond to pressure, to the wheel's spin, to the subtle adjustments that transformed a lump of earth into a vessel. A carpenter planed wood, long curls of shaving falling away, revealing the grain beneath, the surface becoming smooth under his blade. A tanner worked with hides in a yard that smelled so powerful that neighbors complained, and towns often required tanners to locate their workshops downwind, but leather was necessary. So the work continued, despite its assault on the senses. In the strike of hammer on anvil, in the shuttle's passage through the loom, lay not just labor, but identity, the proof of a person's place in the world's machinery. You were smith, weaver, potter, carpenter, not as surname choice, but as fundamental description of who you were and what you contributed. Your skill was your wealth, more reliable than coin, more permanent than property. Buildings burned, money was stolen or spent, but skill lived in your hands and mind, impossible to take away except by injury or death. This skill wasn't learned quickly. An apprentice might begin at 7 or 8 years old, working for a master who provided food and shelter in exchange for labor, and who gradually, over years, transmitted the knowledge of the craft. Not through lectures or manuals, but through demonstration and correction, through watching and attempting, and failing and trying again until the body learned what the mind couldn't fully articulate. After years of apprenticeship came journeyman status, skilled but not yet established, working for wages, moving between masters, accumulating experience and reputation. Eventually, if fortune and ability aligned, came master status, the right to train apprentices, to operate an independent workshop, to hold full standing in the guild. Guilds were more than regulatory bodies imposing rules. They were communities within communities, safety nets in a world without institutional support. A guild member who fell ill might receive assistance from the guild's common fund. A master who died might have his widow permitted to continue the business, at least temporarily, preserving the family's livelihood. Disputes over quality, or pricing, or accusations of unfair practice were mediated by guild officials who understood the craft and could render informed judgment. Young journeymen found work through guild connections. Standards were maintained not primarily through punishment, but through collective interest in preserving the craft's reputation. Yet craft work carried constant tensions. The pride of mastery competed with the pressure of productivity. A smith wanted to make the finest possible blade, but taking too long meant earning too little. A weaver wanted perfect cloth, but family hunger demanded speed. The artistic impulse, the desire to make something beautiful, something that demonstrated skill, battled economic necessity. You balanced these demands daily, making compromises that felt like small betrayals of craft standards, accepting that perfection was a luxury most couldn't afford. The work also exacted physical costs. A smith's hands bore permanent scars from burns, calluses thick as leather, fingers sometimes crooked from breaks that had healed badly. A weaver's eyes deteriorated from years of close work in poor light, often resulting in blindness by middle age. A tanner's sense of smell was destroyed by constant exposure to the chemicals used in hide processing. A potter's lungs filled with fine dust from dry clay. These weren't accidents, but inevitabilities, the price of practicing a craft for decades. The afternoon wore on. The forge maintained its heat. The shuttle continued its passage. The wheel spun. The plane shaved. The mallet struck. Each craftsperson pursued their particular transformation, iron to tool, thread to cloth, clay to vessel, rough wood to smooth board. The work was endless, because human needs were endless, because tools broke, and cloth wore out, and vessels cracked, and structures needed building. So the workshop stayed busy, and the craftspeople bent to their labor, and the skills passed from generation to generation, and the material culture of life continued its slow evolution. One hammer blow, one shuttle pass, one wheel revolution at a time. The spindle turned and turned, thread emerging from formless wool wealth, created from nothing but skill and endless, patient motion. This was the work that built households, yet rarely appeared in the ledgers historians consulted. No wages were recorded, no contracts signed, no guild memberships granted. The labor that sustained human life, the preparation of food, the mending of clothes, the tending of children and the infirm, existed in a peculiar economic shadow. It was essential and boundless, performed primarily by women and children, and almost entirely uncompensated and uncounted. To understand the scope of this work is to understand the true architecture of survival. Women prepared and preserved food, grinding grain into flour, fermenting vegetables, smoking meat, making cheese, rendering fat, drying herbs. They produced textiles from raw fiber, carding wool or flax, spinning thread with drop spindle or wheel, weaving fabric on looms, cutting and sewing garments, patching and darning ware, thin cloth. They bore and nursed children, taught them letters or trades, watched them through illness and recovery. They nursed aging parents and ailing siblings. They hauled water, lit fires, swept floors, cleaned waste, and maintained the constant physical order that prevented a household from dissolving into chaos. They tended kitchen gardens that supplemented purchased food, raised chickens or pigs, gathered wild plants for food and medicine. The list of tasks was not a list at all. It was a perpetual cycle, each activity generating the next in an endless succession that ended only with sleep, if sleep came. Yet the afternoon work of spinning offers an entry point into the experience and skill this labor demanded. Watch her hands. The carded wool secured to the distaff tucked under her left arm, her right hand drawing out fiber while the spindle rotates below, twisting the loose strands into thread of gradually increasing length. The motion appears simple, almost meditative until one attempts it. The thickness must remain consistent. Too thin, and the thread breaks, wasting both time and material. Too thick, and it is unsuitable for fine weaving. This consistency requires constant attention, constant micro-adjustments of pressure and speed. The fingers know the work through repetition, but knowing requires presence. And she was never present only to this task. Her eyes moved between her hands, and the children in the yard had that one climbed too high? Her ears caught her neighbor's voice over the fence, and her lips answered, exchanging news, or complaint, or laughter, while her fingers never faltered in their rhythm. Her mind was simultaneously here, attending to the thread, and elsewhere, calculating how much flour remained, whether the bread could stretch another day, what needed doing before nightfall. This was the invisible dimension of domestic labor, the multiplicity of attention it required, the mental mathematics of scarcity, the simultaneous holding of multiple present needs and future obligations. It was expertise the knowledge of which herbs cooled fever, how to store grain against weevils, how to salt fish so it lasted through winter, how to nurse a child through dysentery with water and broth. This knowledge was as specialized and hard-won as any craftsman's mastery. Yet because it was assumed to be women's natural province, it was rarely named as skill. No one certified it. No apprenticeship formalized its transmission. It was simply expected. The shape of this labor shifted with social class. Wealthy households might employ servants to perform the heaviest work, the back-breaking tasks of hauling water and laundry, while the mistress of the house supervised, mended fine linens, and managed resources. But in these households, too, the work of coordination and planning fell to women. The burden of ensuring nothing was forgotten. In poorer households, children began contributing to domestic labor at young ages, their small hands useful for minding younger siblings, pulling weeds, plucking feathers. The division of labor by gender was stark, yet flexible. Economic necessity could temporarily suspend it, though expectation always reasserted itself. The tragedy of this work was not that it was repetitive. Repetition can be its own form of peace, but that it generated no accumulation, no recognition, no official mark that it had ever occurred. A meal prepared disappeared into hungry mouths. Mended clothes would tear again. Water fetched would be used and need fetching again. The thread spun today would be woven and eventually worn beyond repair. The labor that sustained the household was the same labor that kept it perpetually beginning again. Yet this work was real. This skill was genuine. This labor was not less valuable because it went uncompensated. It was precisely because it was essential that it could be rendered invisible, that its invisibility could be naturalized, that women could be expected to perform it as an expression of their nature, rather than recognized as performing it as work. As shadows lengthen and the afternoon's labor draws toward conclusion, households must turn their attention to the evening meal and the preparations for nightfall. As light drained from the western sky, it pooled instead in hearths and hearts, the day's scattered fragments, gathering into the momentary wholeness of evening. The transformation happened gradually, then suddenly. The sun that had beaten down in harsh angles all afternoon began its descent, and the quality of light shifted. Shadows grew longer, softer. The world's sharp edges blurred, and in households across the countryside and in towns, people began the slow migration homeward. First came those whose work had kept them near the woman at her. Spinning rose stiffly, her fingers cramping into fists to release them from the spindle's rhythm. She moved toward the hearth to tend the fire, which had burned low during the day's focus on textile work. The children, who had played in the yard's fading light, were called inside. Then came those from farther afield. The father from the fields where he had worked since dawn, dirt ground into his skin, and the day's labor still in his muscles. Older children returning from helping neighboring families with their harvests or their stock, perhaps a hired worker who had labored alongside the household's own members. Some arrived hungry and bone-tired. Some arrived with news or quarrels or small victories to recount. All of them converged on the same space, the central room where the fire burned, where food was being prepared, where the day would be gathered up and given shape. This convergence was not primarily a matter of affection, though affection certainly existed. It was practical necessity. Evening labor was different from day labor, and it required collaboration. The fire needed tending. If it had burned low, someone must coax it back to heat. Ingredients needed preparing. Grain to be ground or bread to be retrieved. Vegetables to be cut. Herbs to flavor the pot. Water must be heated. Children required managing. The youngest still needed nursing or minding. The older ones needed direction or correction. And all of this had to happen simultaneously, in the confined space around the hearth, while the light drained away and the family drew closer together, by necessity and by preference. The evening meal was, in most households, the day's substantial meal, the time when the household consumed more than just bread or pottage. Here, the variations of class and season manifested clearly. A wealthy household might have multiple dishes: meat broth, bread, cheese, perhaps ale or wine, vegetables from their garden or stores. Multiple servants might work simultaneously, barely visible to the family members who would eventually eat. A poorer household might heat a pot of grain or beans, stretch it with whatever vegetables or scraps were available, break bread into it. During harvest season, the main meal might be delayed well into the evening work stretching because the day's field work was not yet complete. In winter, when work could be condensed, evening might arrive and be properly honoured. But across these variations, the evening meal held a social architecture beyond mere nutrition. This was when the day was recounted not comprehensively, but in fragments. The child reported the neighbour's ox had escaped. The father described trouble with a boundary line. The mother mentioned a difficult birth attended to, or an herb remedy that had worked. Through these recountings, information circulated, and children learned the world's patterns. This was also when instruction happened, sometimes deliberately and sometimes by osmosis. A parent corrected a child's manners or reasoning. A skill was demonstrated: how to hold a knife, how to judge when bread was ready, how to quiet an anxious younger sibling. Values were transmitted not through lectures, but through the parent's actions and choices. Generosity when there was little to share, patience despite exhaustion, or its opposite, the way some households were tense and silent, controlled by anger or grief. Decisions about the household were made here too, often implicitly. Who would wake before dawn tomorrow? Who would go to the market? What would be done about the roof leak? Sometimes these decisions emerged from discussion. Sometimes they were announced by whoever held authority, usually the oldest or most able-bodied, not always the same person. The firelight softened faces and made the spaces feel smaller, more intimate, more contained. Outside, the darkness deepened. Inside, the warmth gathered. The day's labours, so scattered and various, began to cohere around this central point: the fire, the food, the reassembled family. With the family gathered and the meal prepared, we turned to examine the experience of eating together, a practice that held more meaning than simply consuming nutrition. The wooden bowl passed from hand to hand. It carried more than food. It carried hierarchy, love, memory, and the hope that tomorrow would bring another meal. Even the poorest household observed a structure. The meal did not simply happen. It unfolded according to an order so ingrained that no one needed to state it. The father ate first, receiving the largest portion and often the best of what was available. Adult men came next, then adult women, then children if there was enough. In households struggling against hunger, this hierarchy meant children sometimes received only bread and broth, while adults ate the small pieces of preserved meat or cheese that had been saved. Yet within this rigid framework, intimacy found its expression. A mother would slip an extra crust to a visibly thin child when others were not watching. A father would push his bowl away slightly full, claiming his stomach was satisfied, leaving more for younger mouths. These small acts of love existed, not outside the hierarchy but within it, bending its rules just enough to acknowledge both duty and tenderness. The meal itself was simple in most households. A pottage, a thick stew of grain and vegetables, sometimes thickened with beans or lentils, occasionally containing meat broth or fat for flavour. Bread, broken into pieces and used to soak up the liquid. Perhaps cheese, if the household kept animals and had preserved some through the season. Water, or in some cases weak ale, safer to drink than untreated water. In wealthy households, there might be multiple dishes, spices, fresh fish, or game. In poorer ones, the meal might be indistinguishable from what had been eaten yesterday and would be eaten tomorrow. But whether simple or elaborate, the meal was consumed as ritual, and ritual gave it meaning beyond its nutritional content. The act of sitting together, relative stillness after hours of labor, created a rare opening in the day's relentless motion. This was when voices could rise without urgency, when attention could be paid to something other than immediate tasks. Stories emerged in these moments: the retelling of family history, the recounting of a neighbor's peculiar behavior, the narration of a saint's life, or a folk tale whose moral applied to present circumstance. Knowledge was transmitted through these narratives. How to recognize the signs of an approaching storm, why certain debts should be honored and others forgiven, the proper way to conduct oneself with authority or before superiors. Children learn their families standing in the community through the stories told at meals, the way parents spoke of other families, the jokes made at the expense of rivals, or the respect accorded to those admired. For Christian households, which encompass the vast majority, The meal began with grace, a moment of gratitude and petition, spoken before the first bite. Even in famine years, especially in famine years, grace was spoken. The bread and the pottage were understood as divine provision, and eating them carried faint echoes of the sacrament. This spiritual dimension existed alongside the material one. Hunger and holiness were not separate considerations, but intertwined in the simple act of consumption. Conversation at meals often addressed practical matters, decisions about tomorrow's labor, conflicts that needed resolving, information that had arrived through trade or travel. A daughter might learn when she would be betrothed through an announcement made while eating. A son might understand his father's expectations through casual remarks about work left undone or skills still to be mastered. The meal was thus not a break from the social world, but its concentrated expression, all its hierarchies and affections, its conflicts and cooperations, made visible in who served whom, who spoke, who listened, who received the better portion, and who received less. For most families, the underlying awareness never fully disappeared. This meal might be the last adequate one for weeks if crops failed, if work dried up, if illness struck. Gratitude and anxiety existed in the same bowl, seasoning each other. The ritual's calm surface masked its fragility. Yet perhaps this fragility was part of what made the ritual matter so deeply, because it could be lost. Its ordinariness became precious. After the meal concludes and dishes are cleaned, the household faces the swift approach of darkness, requiring specific preparations and adjustments. Darkness was not merely the absence of day, but a realm of its own, bringing both danger and a strange, deep privacy. Modern people rarely experience true darkness. We flick a switch and banish it entirely. We carry light in our pockets. We move through night as though it was simply a dimmer version of day. But in earlier centuries, darkness was absolute. It was not something that could be overcome with a bulb or a battery. It was something that had to be accommodated, negotiated with, feared, and respected in equal measure. As the sun sank below the horizon and the light drained from the sky, households across the countryside undertook a series of deliberate preparations, some practical, some almost ritualistic in their precision. The animals had to be secured. Chickens were brought inside or herded into their coops. Goats and pigs were penned. The cow or ox, if the family possessed one, was led to its stall in a nearby structure or sheltered space. This was not merely about animal welfare, though that mattered. It was about securing resources. An animal lost to predators overnight was a catastrophic loss, a threat to survival itself. Once the animals were secured, other valuables had to be accounted for. Tools that might rust if left exposed, goods that might be stolen, materials that shouldn't be left vulnerable to weather. Doors were checked and fastened. Shutters, where they existed, were closed and barred. Windows too small for human entry were nonetheless inspected. This boundary making between the controlled space of home and the uncontrolled vastness outside served as both practical security and psychological reassurance. A door bolted was a door holding back, not just potential thieves, but the indefinable threats that darkness seemed to carry with it. The management of light became the evening's central concern. Fire was the primary source, and fire was temperamental. Letting it die completely meant spending the next morning engaged in the difficult, time-consuming work of rekindling it, using flint and steel, or, if fortunate, obtaining flame from a neighbor's hearth. So the fire had to be carefully tended, fed with wood chosen to burn slowly through the night, coaxed into a state where it would survive without collapse until morning. Candles, where available, were precious made from animal fat or precious beeswax. They were too expensive to burn carelessly. Most households used them sparingly, perhaps for specific tasks or occasions. The majority of evening hours were spent in near darkness, lit only by the hearth's glow. This meant that activity necessarily transformed as darkness fell. Complex work requiring precision fine needlework, carpentry, any task demanding focused vision, had to be completed before the light became too poor. As true darkness settled, simpler activities took precedence. Conversation could continue in the dark. Stories could be told. Prayer could be spoken. The family could simply rest. Bodies still. Minds, perhaps wandering. The darkness imposed a rhythm that modern life has largely escaped. When you cannot see, you cease certain forms of work. It is a rhythm that may feel constraining until one recognizes that it is also permission. Permission to stop, permission to be still. Yet darkness carried real dangers, not imagined ones. Fire could spread unseen, growing in the darkness until the household woke to flames already consuming their shelter. Illness could develop overnight, and in darkness, its severity went unassessed until morning revealed the damage done. There were practical fears too. Intruders who might move more safely under cover of darkness, wild animals that hunted at night, the simple hazard of moving through an unfamiliar darkness and falling, striking one's head, breaking bones. These were not paranoid fantasies but reasonable concerns born from living in genuine vulnerability. Yet alongside the danger lived a strange familiarity. People learned to navigate their own homes in darkness, their feet remembering the location of each object, their hands finding what they needed without light's guidance. And darkness brought privacy unknown in daylight. In the darkness, social performance could cease. No one was watching. No one could judge appearance or expression. There was only the body, the breath, the gradual surrender to stillness. With darkness established and preparations complete, we turn to examining the nature of sleep itself, how people rested in an era without modern comforts or security. Sleep was not solitary retreat, but communal surrender, a household descending together into darkness, breathing in rhythm like waves against a shared shore. The modern assumption of sleep is fundamentally solitary. A private room, a bed that belongs to one person, or at most a couple, a door that closes, darkness achieved through heavy curtains. This assumption is so deeply embedded in contemporary life that it feels natural, inevitable, the way sleep simply must be. Yet for most of human history, this was an absolute impossibility for nearly everyone. Sleep happened in shared spaces with multiple bodies, often with livestock, under conditions that would strike modern people as impossibly crowded and uncomfortable. Picture a typical household sleeping arrangement. A single large room, perhaps two if the family were prosperous. In this space, the entire household would gather as darkness fell. Straw covered the floor, sometimes in piles designated as sleeping places, sometimes simply distributed across the room's surface. On top of the straw, people arranged whatever textiles they possessed. Wool blankets, if they were fortunate, old clothing repurposed as covering, perhaps animal skins or hides. There were no private sleeping garments as such. People slept in the clothes they wore during the day, or removed only their outer layers. In wealthier households, there might be a raised bed for the parents, a wooden frame strung with rope, topped with a straw mattress, and covered with better quality blankets. Children and servants arranged themselves around this central fixture, sleeping on the floor or on lower platforms. The intimacy of this arrangement was absolute. Parents slept within arm's reach of children. Siblings slept pressed against each other for warmth and comfort. Servants or laborers slept in the same room, their presence accepted as part of the household structure. There was no privacy in any modern sense of the word, yet people developed strategies for creating mental privacy where physical privacy was impossible. Perhaps the darkness itself provided this as psychological permission to withdraw, even while surrounded by others. Perhaps the familiarity of the arrangement meant that people ceased to experience it as intrusive after childhood. Whatever the mechanism, people slept, and they rested, within conditions that would today be considered unthinkable. The seasons dramatically altered sleeping arrangements. In winter, the body heat of multiple people and animals became not merely comfortable but necessary. Families would gather more tightly, pressing together under whatever coverings they possessed. Animals, the pig, the goats, chickens, were brought inside not primarily out of affection, but out of practical calculation. Their warmth was useful. On the coldest nights, the household became a breathing mass of intertwined humans and animals. The distinction between them blurred in the darkness. In summer, the reverse occurred. Rooms became stifling, and people would move outside when possible, sleeping on straw in the yard or in a separate structure where air could move more freely. Some might sleep under eaves or in partially enclosed spaces, seeking the compromise between shelter and ventilation. Sleep itself was different from modern sleep. People often operated on what scholars call a biphasic sleep pattern. Sleeping for a few hours, waking in the middle of the night, staying awake for an hour or more praying, conversing with a partner. tending to children, and then sleeping again until morning. This was not insomnia. It was simply how sleep naturally occurred when not structured by electric light and alarm clocks. The sleep that came was also lighter, more easily interrupted. A child's cry, the movement of an animal, the sound of wind or rain, the scratch of vermin in the straw, all of these could fracture sleep, pull someone to wakefulness, then allow them to descend again. The soundscape of sleep was rich and constant, breathing, snoring, the subtle movements of bodies shifting position, the creak of the structure settling, the rustle of straw and blankets. These sounds formed a constant backdrop, a kind of acoustic proof that one was not alone in the darkness. For someone accustomed to it from childhood, this was probably soothing the evidence that others were present, surviving the night alongside you. Yet sleep in such conditions was also vulnerable. Fear of fire meant that even while sleeping, part of one's attention remained alert to its danger. Parents listened even in sleep for the signs of a child's illness, a change in breathing, a cry of distress. The vulnerability was real, and it shaped the quality of rest, making it simultaneously communal and cautious, safe and fragile. The textures and smells of these sleeping spaces were distinctive. Straw held dust and insects. Its scratching against skin was constant. Wool blankets, heavy and often damp, retained the scent of smoke that permeated everything in a fire-scented household. The close warmth of multiple bodies created a particular smell, not unpleasant necessarily, but distinctive, intimate, inescapable. These sensory details formed the backdrop of sleep, the environment one descended into each night. Having established where and how people slept, we now turn to examine the mental landscape of sleep dreams, fears, and the beliefs that shaped how people understood the nighttime realm. In the country of sleep, the dead walked beside the living, and the future whispered its secrets to those who knew how to listen. We cannot truly know the dreams of people who left no written record. Their interior nights remain inaccessible to us, locked behind centuries, and the simple fact that sleep and dreams exist only in the moment of their occurrence. Yet we can know something of the frameworks through which they would have interpreted their dreams, the cultural languages they would have used to make sense of the visions that visited them in darkness. And in understanding this, we glimpse something of how they experienced the fundamental human mystery of sleep itself. Dreams were not viewed as mere psychological phenomena, the random firing of a sleeping brain's neurons. Dreams were communications. They carried meaning, intention, message. A dream might be a visitation from God, an instruction from a saint, a warning from a deceased relative, or a temptation from darker forces. A dream was an event, something that had happened to you, not something your mind had merely produced. This distinction shaped how people treated their dream experiences, with seriousness, with attention, sometimes with fear. The anxiety dreams would have been numerous and predictable, reflecting the waking terrors that structured daily life. A dream of failed harvest, of crops withering in the field before reaping could begin. A dream of illness spreading through the household, children feverish, adults unable to rise for work. A dream of fire consuming the home, of animals lost, of debts called due that could not be paid. These dreams were not nightmares of the surreal or impossible, but nightmares of the plausibly catastrophic, the disasters that could actually arrive. They manifested the fears that people carried into sleep, transformed and magnified by the dream's logic. Then there were the fever dreams, the visions that came during illness, when the body burned with heat and the mind seemed to separate from ordinary reality. These were often interpreted as spiritual battles, the self struggling against malevolent forces, sometimes guided by protective saints or angels. A fever dream could be evidence of demonic attack or divine testing. Recovery from severe illness might be attributed not to luck or medical knowledge, but to spiritual victory in the nighttime realm. Some dreams recurred, visiting a person again and again across months or years. These were particularly significant. A recurring dream was understood as a message that had not yet been fully heard, a warning or instruction that demanded attention. Certain people in communities, often older women whose own lives had taught them much about suffering and survival, developed reputations as dream interpreters. Someone troubled by a dream would seek them out, describe the vision in detail, and wait to hear what meaning these experienced observers could extract from it. Beyond ordinary dreams lay the specific terror of the night demon, the incubus or mare that pressed down upon the sleeper's chest, causing a sensation of suffocation, paralysis, and overwhelming dread. Modern medical science would recognize this as sleep paralysis, a phenomenon where the conscious mind awakens while the body remains in the paralysis that normally accompanies REM sleep. But in the historical imagination, this was no mere physiological malfunction. This was demonic attack, a real presence that had entered the bedroom, that sat upon one's body with malevolent weight. People developed defenses against this. Prayers spoken before sleep, prayers upon waking in the middle of the night, religious objects placed near the bed, a crucifix, a palm frond from a blessed Palm Sunday, salt at the threshold. Some arranged their clothing in particular ways, folded blankets with specific intent, positioned furniture to create protection. These practices were not superstition in the dismissive sense. They were meaningful actions taken against a real threat, as understood within the person's cultural framework. The boundary between waking and sleeping was perhaps less distinct in an era without artificial light and constant stimulation. In darkness, with minimal sensory input, the mind could drift across this boundary in ways modern experience rarely permits. Hallucinations at the edge of sleep, the hypnagogic visions that come as one enters sleep, or the hypnopompic visions that come upon waking, might blend seamlessly with reality. A figure glimpsed in the darkness might be a family member moving about the room, or might be something other entirely, the question of which could remain genuinely uncertain. Some nights brought wakefulness that was not nightmare, but something else, a kind of floating awareness, the body resting, while the mind remained alert and oddly peaceful. Other nights brought restlessness, discomfort, the constant shifting of position seeking comfort that would not come. The night was not uniform in its quality. It varied person to person, night to night, carrying its own weather and emotional atmosphere. While some household members slept, others remained wakeful through the night hours, maintaining vigils for various reasons, a dimension of nightlife often overlooked in historical accounts. In the deepest hours, when darkness pressed closest, some remained awake keepers of flame, guardians of the breathing, witnesses to the night's slow passage. While the household descended into sleep, certain figures remained wakeful, their presence defining a different kind of night. These were the practical watchers, those for whom sleep was a luxury temporarily surrendered in service of necessity. A mother sat beside a feverish child, her eyes adjusting to the dimness, her attention fixed on the small rising and falling of the child's chest. Was the breathing still regular? Had the fever broken or intensified? These questions could not be answered from across a room. They required presence, vigilance, the constant monitoring that only a parent's vigil could provide. Hours passed in this stillness, not peaceful but purposeful, each moment containing its own anxiety and small reassurances. Elsewhere in different homes, a woman endured labor, and with her remained the midwife, and perhaps her mother, or another female relative, their presence a combination of practical support and moral witness. Labor in darkness was labor without the ability to see one's own body's progress, without the visual confirmation that movement was occurring. The night seemed to amplify both pain and time. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The darkness became almost a presence itself, something one labored within and against. And in still other households, someone maintained a deathbed vigil. A parent slipping toward death, the family gathered but mostly sleeping, with one person taking the watch, a daughter perhaps, or the spouse remaining alert to any change in breathing or consciousness. These vigils existed between worlds, neither fully of the living world's concerns, nor yet of whatever lay beyond. The watcher remained present, available, witnessing this passage that they could not control or even fully comprehend. The quality of wakefulness in the small hours was different from daytime alertness. Sounds became magnified. A creak in the structure, barely noticeable in daylight, became a distinct sound in darkness, something one noticed and sometimes misinterpreted. The mind worked differently too. Without external stimulation, without the constant input of a working day, the thinking self operated at a different frequency. Memory became more accessible, emotional concerns more vivid. Worries that could be set aside during day rose up with particular intensity in the night's silence. Time itself behaved strangely during these hours. A night hour seemed longer than a day hour. Minutes could crawl with unbearable slowness, or entire stretches of time could dissolve without clear memory of how they had passed. This distortion of time was part of what made night wakefulness so exhausting, not merely the physical fatigue of missing sleep, but the psychological effort of moving through time that seemed to move at a different rate than the world moved. In daylight, people remained wakeful for many reasons. Some rose in the small hours for religious devotion, to pray during the time they believed God was most attentive to petition. Some lay awake because anxiety would not permit sleep, fear of unpaid debts, worry about a child's marriage prospects, concern about harvest prospects, anger over a conflict that remained unresolved. Some could not sleep because of physical discomfort, the cold that no amount of blankets could fully penetrate, hunger when food stores were depleted, pain from injury or illness, or the simple discomfort of a body pressed against too many other bodies in insufficient space. For those who remained wakeful voluntarily or involuntarily, the hours held their own activities and textures. Prayer came easily in the darkness, the words shaped not by external sound, but by interior intention. Conversations happened quiet, urgent, or meandering between a parent and a sleepless child, or between two adults who had both woken and found each other conscious in the dark. Mental preparation for the day ahead occupied some of these hours, a worker mentally rehearsing tasks that needed completion, solving problems that had resisted solution during working hours. Sometimes there was simply stillness, lying without sleep, thinking or not thinking, simply enduring the passage of time until sleep finally came, or until dawn arrived, and day began again. This forced solitude, the hours alone with one's thoughts, was a kind of experience that modern life rarely permits. Television, radio, books, conversation. The constant availability of external stimulation means that few modern people spend extended time with only their own thoughts for company. In the historical night, there was no such option. If one could not sleep, one was alone with one's mind, with memory, with worry, with prayer, with whatever the interior self produced when external distraction was unavailable. Some people, however, were not watchers by circumstance, but by profession. Bakers rose in hours so dark that night, watchmen still patrolled the streets, beginning the long work of preparing bread, so that it would be ready when dawn customers arrived. Night watchmen themselves walked the streets and stood at posts, calling out the hours, watching for the particular danger of fire that could spread with terrifying speed through sleeping communities. Shepherds remained awake with their flocks, protecting animals from predators, the work of vigilance through the night part of their necessary labor. These night workers existed in a liminal space, occupying a social position outside the normal rhythms of the community they served. They kept the community safe while living by different hours, their experience of night fundamentally shaped by work, rather than sleep or wakefulness alone. As night progresses toward its darkest hours, and then begins its subtle shift toward dawn, we examine the cyclical nature of this daily rhythm and its variations across season. Winter was not a season but a siege, the sun itself seeming to abandon the earth, leaving only cold, darkness, and the question of whether supplies would last until spring. In modern experience, winter is an inconvenience. Occasionally beautiful, sometimes dangerous if one ventures into it unprepared. But one exits winter by stepping into a heated room, turning up a thermostat, wearing synthetic layers designed to trap warmth. For most of human history, there was no exit. Winter was something one endured for months, and the outcome of that endurance was genuinely uncertain. The physical reality began early, weeks before the winter solstice. The sun's arc across the sky lowered visibly week by week. Light that had lasted until evening now vanished by mid-afternoon. This diminishment was not merely inconvenient, it was catastrophic for productivity. Outdoor work required light. Complex tasks needed visibility. As daylight contracted, so did the hours available for labor. Harvesting had to be completed before the light grew too poor. Fields had to be prepared before frost hardened the earth. Any work that required precision or strength had to be finished during the brief hours of daylight. Winter forced a compression of activity that was exhausting and anxious. Long before this compression began, preparations started. Food had to be stored grain in sealed containers protected from vermin. Vegetables buried in root cellars, meat salted or smoked, fruit preserved in honey or alcohol if available. The storage calculations were grim mathematics. How many months must be fed? How many mouths? If the stored food ran out before spring, there were no alternatives. Fuel had to be gathered, wood cut and stacked, dried dung collected where wood was scarce, peat carved from bogs. A household that entered winter with inadequate fuel faced not mere discomfort, but real danger. Without heat, without warmth maintained through the night, people died. Structures were inspected and repaired. Roofs were checked for damage that wind and snow would exploit. Walls were caulked against drafts. Windows, if they existed, were covered with oiled cloth or animal membrane to permit some light while blocking wind. These repairs were essential. A roof that leaked meant damp that could not be dried, promoting illness and decay. Walls without caulking meant cold that penetrated, making the interior barely warmer than outside. And then winter arrived in earnest, and preparation time ended. The cold came as a presence, a weight, a constant companion. It was not the brief chill of stepping outside for a few minutes. It was cold that one lived within, that shaped every motion, that made thinking slow and fingers clumsy. The cold penetrated even well-constructed homes. It seeped through walls. It radiated from floors. Fires were kept burning constantly, but the heat they generated extended only so far from the hearth. Distances of just a few feet meant significantly colder temperatures. People crowded close to the fire, and as they did, they crowded into shared spaces, small rooms, often poorly ventilated, filled with smoke and the exhalation of multiple bodies. In these conditions, illness flourished. Respiratory diseases spread through populations living in close proximity, breathing stale, smoke-filled air. Coughs became universal. Fevers struck children and the elderly with particular severity. Childbirth, which happened regardless of season, became more dangerous in winter, a woman weakened by cold, by scarcity. By the strain of the season itself was a woman more vulnerable to complications. The very young and the very old died most frequently in winter. It was simply a fact, accepted with sorrow but without surprise. Some children would not see spring. Some elders would not survive the cold. Winter was a culling, and societies structured themselves around this brutal reality. The psychological weight of winter should not be underestimated. The oppressive darkness, the confinement, the knowledge that escape was impossible, that one could not step outside for relief because outside meant dangerous cold. This created a particular mental state. Energy was lower. Motivation diminished. The horizon of time became compressed. One did not think about spring, as though it were a real place one might eventually reach. Spring was a rumor, a promise, something one might hope for without truly believing in it. Yet within this hardship existed small mercies and unexpected beauties. Snow transformed a familiar landscape into something alien and strange, almost forgiving in its white coverage. Bodies pressed together for warmth created a particular kind of intimacy not always welcome, sometimes uncomfortable, but also sometimes profoundly comforting. A well-stocked larder, visible and available, offered reassurance. A fire that burned steadily through the night was a genuine achievement, proof that one had prepared adequately. These small satisfactions existed alongside the suffering, neither cancelling the other out but coexisting in the complex reality of winter endurance. As winter eventually releases its grip, we turn to examine spring not just as winter's opposite, but as a season with its own particular challenges and character. Spring arrived not as savior, but as gambler, offering hope in exchange for backbreaking labor, and the acceptance that all might still be lost to frost, flood, or blight. The first signs were subtle. The sun's arc climbed higher in the sky, its light lingering later into the afternoon. The air, still cold in the mornings, began to carry warmth by midday. Patches of snow retreated. The frozen earth softened at its surface. These changes were genuine relief after months of winter's grip. Yet for those dependent on agriculture, which meant nearly everyone's spring's arrival triggered not celebration, but a particular kind of dread. Spring was not renewal without cost. Spring was the most demanding season of the entire year, and its demands arrived without mercy or flexibility. The fields had to be prepared. This meant ploughing, one of the most labor-intensive tasks of the agricultural cycle. The plough had to break through earth that had been hard frozen, that was still cold and resistant. A plough team, whether oxen or horses, was necessary, and not every household possessed one. Those who did were crucial to their community. Those who didn't faced complex negotiations about borrowing, sharing, or paying for access. As the plough turned the earth, manure had to be spread. The accumulated dung from winter's confined animals, now applied to enrich the soil. This work was relentless, exhausting, and had to be completed within a narrow window. Delay meant shortened growing season. Rush meant mistakes that could diminish yields. Seed had to be prepared and planted. The timing was agonizing. Plant too early, before the danger of late frost had passed, and a single night of freezing could destroy everything. The entire spring's labor, the entire year's hopes, lost to a weather event that could not be predicted or prevented. Yet delay planting too long meant insufficient time for the crop to mature before harvest. This balance required knowledge observation of weather patterns, understanding of soil conditions, some element of intuition. Communities often relied on traditional dates passed down through generations, yet even tradition could fail in unusual years. The work of spring was relentless and left little energy for other tasks. Yet simultaneously, this was typically the hungriest time of year. Winter's stored food had dwindled. Grain that had seemed abundant in autumn was now nearly exhausted. Vegetables stored in root cellars had rotted or been consumed. The preserved meat was gone. And the new crops were weeks or months away from bearing anything edible. This period, historians call the hungry months, was a genuine crisis of food security that repeated every spring. Hunger in these months was not the mild appetite of a skipped meal or a diet. It was persistent, weakening, demoralizing. Bellies ached with emptiness. Energy flagged. Thinking became difficult. Children grew listless. The elderly grew frailer. Mothers rationed what remained, giving larger portions to those doing the most physically demanding work, the ploughmen, the laborers, at the expense of the young, the old, and sometimes themselves. Supplementing the dwindling grain stores required foraging. Early spring greens gathered from roadsides and fields, roots dug from the earth, anything edible that could be found and prepared quickly. Yet within this hardship existed something powerful: hope. Each green shoot emerging from the soil represented survival. Each sprouted seed meant food was coming, that the year might not be a failure, that one might actually eat in coming months. The returning sun meant warmer nights, which meant less fuel consumed, which meant resources extended further. Longer days meant more hours for work, more time to accomplish the tasks spring demanded. The body, despite hunger, moved with a different energy than it had in winter's depression. Spring brought rituals that expressed this balance of hope and anxiety. Religious festivals, Beltane, Easter, May Day, depending on region and faith, coincided with agricultural cycles. These were not merely spiritual occasions, but calendrical markers, moments when the community acknowledged transitions and offered propitiation to forces beyond human control. Prayers for good harvest, blessings on fields, offerings to saints, or other spiritual powers associated with fertility and growth. Individual households might perform small rituals, the placement of blessed palms in fields, the speaking of particular words over planted seeds, the careful observation of omens that might predict the season's success or failure. The psychological state of spring was paradoxical. People were exhausted, hungry, anxious, and yet they permitted themselves to hope. They labored not in despair, but in the cautious belief that labor might yield results. This hope was guarded. People knew that frost could strike in May, that unseasonable rain could rot seeds, that locusts or blight could destroy crops even after they had grown. Hope existed alongside the acceptance of uncertainty, the knowledge that effort did not guarantee outcome. This sophisticated emotional stance, hopeful yet realistic, energetic yet wary, shaped how people moved through spring's demands. Where spring was anxious labor and hope, summer brought a different rhythm: longer days, harder work, and the first rewards of spring's planting. Summer poured out its abundance with one hand, while demanding payment in sweat and aching muscles, with the other generosity and cruelty intertwined like wheat stalks. The light of summer was relentless. Dawn arrived impossibly early, sometimes before 4 a.m. as the sun climbed toward the horizon. Dusk lingered late, the sky remaining bright well past 8 at night. This meant that working daylight stretched to 14, 16, sometimes 18 hours. Sleep became compressed into the brief window of true darkness. The effect was not energizing, but exhausting. There was no real rest, no extended period of darkness that permitted the body's complete recuperation. The sun, which had been so missed during winter, became something different in summer. A constant presence, a constant pressure, a relentless demand for activity. The work was unforgiving. Crops planted in spring now needed constant attention. Weeds grew as enthusiastically as the cultivated plants and had to be pulled or hoed away, often multiple times through the season. Pests attacked the growing plants' insects that could devastate a field if left unchecked. Weather was monitored constantly. A sudden hailstorm could destroy weeks of growth in minutes. Unseasonable rain could create conditions for crop diseases. A drought meant constant anxiety about water availability. Early harvests had already begun. Peas picked in their pods, early grains cut and bound, vegetables from kitchen gardens harvested daily. Hay had to be cut at precisely the right moment when the grass had dried enough to be nutritious, but not so dry that it became brittle and lost value. Once cut, hay had to be dried in the sun, which meant ideal weather was essential. A rainy period during haymaking could ruin the entire crop, leaving livestock without adequate winter fodder. All of this work was performed in heat that was genuine and unrelenting. The sun beat down on fields and on workers laboring in them. There was no shade, no escape. Sweat soaked through clothing. Dust and chaff stuck to skin made wet with perspiration. The body's water stores depleted faster than they could be replenished. Heat exhaustion was a real possibility, and heat stroke could strike without warning. Yet the work could not stop because the crops would not wait. The pressure of timing created a particular kind of desperation. One labored, despite the heat, because not laboring meant potential disaster. Yet summer brought genuine relief in other ways. The household's diet shifted dramatically. Fresh vegetables appeared daily from kitchen gardens: beans, peas, squash, leafy greens. Herbs grew abundantly. Berries ripened and could be gathered. Animals on summer pasture produced more milk, and this meant cheese and butter could be made in larger quantities. For the first time since spring's hungry months, abundant food was available without depletion of stored resources. The body, nourished adequately for the first time in months, responded with renewed energy despite the labor demands. The risks of summer abundance were constant. Everything in the fields was vulnerable. A hailstorm at the wrong moment could obliterate a field's potential in minutes. Early frosts, rare, but possible even in summer, could damage tender crops. Pests could multiply exponentially in warm weather. The crop growing in the field represented months of labor and planning, and its loss would mean hunger in winter. This reality created a particular psychological state. Gratitude for the abundance, combined with constant vigilance against its loss. Summer also transformed the social landscape. Longer days and better weather meant more opportunity for community interaction. Neighbors worked together during crucial harvests, sharing labor that individual households could not manage alone. Summer festivals, saints' days that coincided with agricultural cycles, provided brief respites from labor. These were moments of celebration, of feasting on summer's abundance, of acknowledging the community's mutual dependence. Yet even these celebrations often involved labor. The preparation of special foods, the maintenance of community rituals, the discussions of shared concerns. The physical experience of summer labor left its mark on the body. Each evening brought profound exhaustion. Muscles ached in ways that sleep barely relieved. Blisters formed and hardened into calluses. Skin darkened from sun exposure. The body became an instrument of labor, pushed to its limits day after day. Yet alongside this exhaustion came a particular kind of satisfaction. The crops were visibly growing. Harvest approached. The months of uncertain hunger were behind, and abundance was real and tangible. The sweat and aching muscles were the price of survival, and that price was being paid. Nights in summer, though brief, had their own quality. The heat meant that sleeping indoors was often uncomfortable, and people sometimes slept outdoors or in partially open spaces to catch whatever breeze existed. The brief darkness was warm, not cold, and the body could rest more easily than in winter's bone-numbing chill. For those fortunate enough to have completed their day's labor before exhaustion became overwhelming, there was time for quiet activities. conversation with family or neighbors, the tending of small tasks, or simply the luxury of rest. As summer's labor culminated, we arrive at autumn, the season of harvest, preservation, and preparation for winter's return. The grain lay measured in storage, each bushel a verdict abundance or scarcity, survival or suffering, all determined by seeds planted months ago and weather beyond any mortal's control. Autumn arrived, carrying a peculiar tension. Relief mingled with anxiety, celebration with exhaustion, gratitude with a strange kind of dread. For most farming families, this was the moment toward which the entire year had been directed. All the labor of spring, all the tending of summer, all the anxious hope and careful calculation came down to this: the harvest. And the harvest was unforgiving in its truth-telling. The fields would yield what they yielded. There was no negotiating with crops, no explaining to grain why more was needed than what had grown. The harvest was nature's answer to all the year's efforts, and that answer was final. The grain harvest was the most critical event of the agricultural year. Standing grain in the fields was grain in constant danger. A hailstorm could destroy it. Heavy rain could lodge it, flatten it against the earth, making cutting impossible until it dried again. Pests could infest the ripening heads. Theft was a real concern. Neighbors or strangers might slip into a field at night and gather grain before the rightful owner. Time was the crucial variable. Every day of delay between ripeness and harvest increased risk. This reality created a particular atmosphere, urgency mixed with the physical exhaustion that came from constant labor. The actual work of harvest was among the most demanding of the entire year. Every capable family member participated. Neighbors exchanged labor, one family working in another's fields, with the understanding that when harvest reached that family's land, the same assistance would be returned. The work began at dawn and continued until darkness made it impossible. Grain was cut using sickles for small fields or scythes for larger areas tools that required precise, repetitive motion performed thousands of times daily. The cut grain was gathered into bundles called sheaves and bound with twisted grain stalks. These sheaves were arranged into shocks, conical stacks that allowed the grain to dry while protecting it from rain. The work was relentless. Bend, cut, gather, bind, arrange, move forward. Bend, cut, gather, bind, arrange, move forward. Hours of this motion, week after week, until the fields were cleared. Weather became an obsession during harvest. A clear day meant the harvest could proceed unimpeded. A cloud formation in the distance triggered calculation. Could we cut another field before rain arrived? The psychological pressure was constant. Families monitored the sky with the intensity of those whose entire year's survival depended on atmospheric conditions, which, of course, it did. The moment when the final sheaf was cut held particular significance. Often this was marked with ceremony, a small celebration, a ritual phrase, the cutting of the last grain accompanied by cheers or prayers. In some traditions, the last sheaf was saved and kept through winter, believed to contain the field's fertility for the next year. The ritual acknowledged what had just been achieved. The harvest was complete. The field was bare. Months of uncertainty were resolved into this. The grain was cut, bound, secured. The first phase of the year's judgment was complete, but the judgment was not yet finished. The grain had to be threshed, beaten, or trampled to separate the seed grain from the chaff. This work continued through autumn into winter, sometimes occupying months of labor. And then came the calculations, the measurements, the true accounting. How much grain had been harvested? This was measured carefully, often using standardized measures that represented both volume and weight. How much must be saved as seed grain for next year's planting? This was calculated based on field size and historical averages, and saving inadequate seed meant disaster next spring. How much was owed in rent to a landlord or to the church as tithe? These obligations had to be met, or the family faced legal or spiritual consequences. How much remained for the family's own consumption through the coming year? This was the true measure of the harvest's success or failure. The calculations revealed the year's reality. If the harvest had been abundant and yields good, the family might eat well, might have grain to sell for cash, might even feel something like security. If the harvest had been poor, damaged by weather, diminished by pests, or affected by other misfortune, hard choices loomed. Perhaps grain had to be carefully rationed. Perhaps the family would need to borrow from wealthier neighbors, creating debt that would have to be repaid. Perhaps winter would bring real hunger, despite best efforts. This moment of accounting was complex emotionally. Relief that the harvest was complete and secure mingled with anxiety about whether the stores would prove sufficient. Pride might accompany a good harvest, or disappointment if the results were merely adequate or poor. For many families, the grain measured in storage represented the difference between comfort and hardship, between adequate nutrition and the persistent hunger of lean years. The grain was not merely food, it was security, or the lack thereof. It was hope measured in bushels. With grain harvested and measured, households turned to the equally crucial work of preservation, transforming fresh food into forms that could last through winter. Each jar sealed, each haunch salted, each apple dried was a small victory against winter's hunger preservation as both craft and prayer. Without refrigeration, without trucks delivering food year-round, without supermarket shelves restocked weekly, survival through winter depended entirely on autumn's abundance, being transformed into forms that could endure. This transformation was not simple drying or salting of food. It was alchemy, the conversion of perishable plenty into lasting substance. And it required knowledge, skill, constant attention, and considerable labor work that was primarily women's domain, though the entire household might participate. Salting meat was perhaps the most crucial preservation technique. When animals were slaughtered in autumn, a necessity before winter, when animals could no longer forage, and feeding them through the cold months would be impossible, the meat had to be preserved or wasted. The process began immediately. Fresh meat was cut into pieces, and salt was rubbed into every surface. The knowledge of proper salting was critical. Enough salt to preserve the meat by drawing out moisture and preventing decay, but not so much as to make the meat inedible with overwhelming saltiness. The meat was layered in barrels with salt, pressed down to extract more liquid, checked regularly to ensure it remained submerged in brine. Alternatively, meat could be smoked, hung in smokehouses, where fire and smoke slowly dried it, while adding flavor and additional preservative properties. The smell of smoking meat became the smell of autumn, acrid, pungent, carrying the promise of winter survival. Drying was simpler but required patience and favorable conditions. Fruits, apples, pears, berries were sliced thinly and laid on flat surfaces or threaded on strings to dry in the sun and wind. Herbs were gathered at their peak potency, bundled, and hung in bunches in dry locations. Fish, where it was available, was split lengthwise and hung to dry, the flesh slowly desiccating while developing a concentrated flavor. The vigilance required was constant, watching for rain that would interrupt the drying, protecting drying foods from animals or thieves, monitoring for insects or mold. Dried foods were lighter than fresh and took up less storage space, making them ideal for storage in quantities large enough to last months. Pickling vegetables transformed them through brine or vinegar, creating a preservation medium hostile to decay. Cucumbers became pickles through immersion in seasoned brine, their texture transforming from crisp to something softer but stable. Cabbages were shredded and layered with salt, becoming sauerkraut through fermentation. Recipes for these preparations were treasured, passed from mothers to daughters across generations, each family or region having particular variations and techniques. The preparation of pickling vessels was itself a skill. They had to be clean enough to prevent contamination, sealed in ways that kept out air while allowing gases to escape, often sealed with cloth tied tightly over the opening, or lids that sat loosely enough to permit fermentation, but tightly enough to protect contents. The psychology of preservation was complex. There was satisfaction in seeing stores accumulate jars sealed and stored, meat hanging in smokehouses, dried fruits packed in cloth, pickled vegetables arranged on shelves. This visible abundance was reassuring, concrete proof that winter could be faced. Yet anxiety also accompanied preservation work. Had the salt penetrated deeply enough? Might the meat spoil despite efforts? Could mold be developing unseen inside sealed jars? The discovery of spoiled food, the burst jar, the meat that had developed a sickly smell, the mass of mold covering preserved fruit, was not merely disappointing. It was catastrophic. It represented stored nutrition transformed back into waste, survival stores diminished by failure. Even as preservation work continued, careful rationing began. Families started consuming some of the stored food immediately, not from greed, but from knowledge. Preserved food deteriorated over time, so there was an optimal order for consumption. Foods that kept well were saved for late winter. Foods that deteriorated more quickly were eaten first. Some preserved foods developed increasingly strong flavors as they aged, becoming difficult to eat by winter's end. The family that had planned carefully might transition from fresh preserved foods to aged, dried, intensely flavored foods as the season advanced. Certain foods resisted preservation entirely. Fresh milk couldn't be kept. It had to be transformed into cheese or butter within hours. Cheesemaking was women's work, requiring knowledge of temperature, timing, and technique. Butter was made by churning cream, hard physical work that children sometimes participated in. These fresh dairy products provided crucial nutrition, but they too required consumption before spoilage or storage in forms like salted butter that could survive longer. The sensory experience of preservation work permeated autumn. The smell of smoking meat and salt, the sight of surfaces covered with drying foods, the sound of liquid boiling for pickling or jam making, the feel of salt rough against skin, of wet cloth wrung out repeatedly, of muscles aching from the repetitive motions of preparation. These sensations formed the physical reality of readying the household for winter. While households worked to preserve food, they also needed to prepare their homes and possessions for winter's assault, completing a cycle of readiness. Each repaired thatch, each stacked cord of wood, each sealed gap was a conversation with the coming cold preparation as both defense and acceptance. The house itself demanded attention as autumn advanced. Over summer's warm months, structures had endured, thatch had weathered, daub filling the gaps between structural timbers had cracked. Small openings that had been acceptable, or even welcome, for ventilation in heat, became liabilities as cold approached. The work of fortification was methodical and necessary. Thatch damaged by weather or animals was repaired, bundles of straw or reeds carefully layered and secured. Gaps where daub had fallen away were filled with new daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung that would harden and create an insulating barrier. Shutters were checked to ensure they would close properly and remain closed against winter wind. Every point where the exterior met the interior, every potential pathway for cold air to enter, received attention. Fuel was the other crucial preparation. Wood had to be gathered and stacked, split into sizes that would fit the hearth, arranged so it could dry while being protected from rain. In regions where wood was scarce, peat was cut from bogs, carefully dried and stockpiled. In some areas, dried animal dung was collected, formed into cakes, and stacked for burning. The fuel gathered had to be sufficient to maintain fires throughout months of winter, not merely for heating, but for cooking, for light, for survival itself. A household that entered winter with inadequate fuel faced genuine danger. The calculation of how much was enough was made through experience. How many cords had been sufficient last year? Did we have more or fewer family members to warm? Was this year's supply visibly larger than last year's, or smaller? Stored goods were reviewed and their status taken stock of. How much grain remained? Preserved meat? Dried vegetables? Were there gaps where more needed to be acquired before winter trading opportunities ended? Families engaged in calculation, and sometimes negotiation, determining what could be bartered or purchased, from wealthier neighbors or from traveling merchants. This was also when families assessed whether they would face scarcity and began to mentally prepare for rationing or borrowing. The work of autumn preparation was also an opportunity to take stock of tools and equipment. Would the plough need repair before spring? Did the scythe need sharpening or replacement? Were there worn items of clothing that needed mending before they deteriorated beyond repair? Broken pottery could be replaced or repaired. Damaged baskets could be rewoven. The mentality was one of completion. Before winter made outdoor work difficult, everything that could be addressed was addressed. Nothing would be easy to fix once cold and darkness arrived. The emotional dimension of this preparation was complex. There was satisfaction in feeling ready. Each completed task represented a small security, a small reduction in winter's potential for disaster. Yet anxiety accompanied thoroughness. The more carefully one prepared, the more vividly one imagined potential failures. What if the thatch failed to keep out rain? What if fuel ran short? What if stored food spoiled? No amount of preparation could guarantee safety, only increase its probability. There was also a kind of resignation, born from experience. No matter how thoroughly one prepared, winter would find weaknesses and exploit them. There would be unexpected failures, surprising shortages, problems no one had anticipated. This knowledge didn't prevent preparation, it merely contextualized it. As days visibly shortened, the daily rhythms of the household transformed. In summer, work had been external and continuous. People scattered across fields or engaged in various tasks required good light to accomplish safely. As autumn advanced and days contracted, outdoor work naturally concluded earlier. By late afternoon, as light began failing, people came indoors. The evening hours that had been brief in summer became substantial. Families spent these hours together in ways summer permitted only occasionally. Conversation, storytelling, the quieter crafts that didn't require daylight. The frequent interactions with neighbors that characterized summer the shared labor. The community gatherings began to contract as families turned inward, focused on their own household's readiness. The quality of autumn light itself changed as the season advanced. The sun, high and bright in summer, descended lower on the horizon. Its light took on a particular slant, creating long shadows and a golden quality that carried melancholy. Dusk arrived progressively earlier, the day compressed by invisible degrees. Mornings grew colder. Frost appeared on grass, then melted as day warmed. Then the frost remained longer, and finally it didn't melt at all. These signals were read by people attuned to seasonal shifts. The body felt the changing temperature. The eyes registered the changing light. And somewhere in the mind, the ancient knowledge registered. Prepare, consolidate, prepare. Yet preparation brought no dread in the way modern people might approach a threatening season. This was the eternal cycle. Spring came and brought planting. Summer brought growth and harvest. Autumn brought preservation and preparation. Winter brought rest and endurance. People knew their role in this cycle intimately. Winter was hard, yes, but it was also inevitable, expected, familiar. The work of preparation was not resistance against the natural order, but participation in it. With homes prepared and stores accumulated, we shift from the external world of physical preparation to the internal world of community and belief systems that sustained people through hardship. The year turned not merely by sun and season, but by a calendar of saints and sacraments, each day named, each task blessed, every labor embedded in divine narrative. For common people in Christian Europe, time did not primarily flow according to numbered dates or abstract calendars. Time was marked by saints. Each day carried the name of a saint whose feast day it was, and the calendar that mattered was this sacred calendar. Monday might be significant not for its position in a week, but because it fell near the feast of a particular saint, whose intercession was valued for specific concerns. A month's identity came not from its number, but from its religious character. The month containing Easter, the month of harvest festivals, the month when certain penitential practices intensified. This sacred calendar overlaid and intersected with the agricultural calendar, creating a comprehensive framework through which all activity was understood. The timing of agricultural work was not separate from religious observance, but integrated with it. Street Martin's Day, celebrated on November 11, traditionally marked the time when animals were slaughtered for winter, a necessity born from practical reality. Animals could not be fed through winter months when fodder was unavailable or depleted. Keeping them alive would cost more than they were worth. So in autumn, practical calculation dictated slaughter. But this same practical necessity was transformed into religious observance. The slaughter became part of the Martinmas festival, the practical converted into the sacred. This conversion was not cynical or superficial, it was genuine transformation. The killing of animals, which involved bloodshed and some violence, could thus be situated within a religious narrative, blessing and meaning attached to necessity. The Rogation Days, observed in the period before Ascension Day, exemplified the integration of prayer and agricultural anxiety. These were days of procession, where the community walked the boundaries of the parish, blessing fields and crops. Priests walked at the head, prayers were spoken, and the physical landscape was sanctified through movement and invocation. This was a time when the growing crops were vulnerable still months from harvest, susceptible to hail, pests, disease. The prayer and blessing was genuine petition. Please protect our crops. Please ensure harvest. Please preserve us from want. The physical action of processing through the landscape was both spiritual and practical. It marked boundaries, reinforced community, and created an opportunity for collective anxiety about crops to be acknowledged and communally addressed through the framework of prayer. Harvest itself was marked with religious celebration that transformed practical gratitude into sacred festival. Lammas, celebrated on August 1, marked the beginning of the grain harvest. Michaelmas, on September 29, marked its conclusion. The first sheaf of grain might be blessed before being brought to threshing. The final sheaf might be ritually processed. Harvest festivals gathered communities in gratitude and celebration, but embedded in this celebration was the acknowledgement of dependency. The food about to be stored was not merely the result of human labor. It was divine gift, providential bounty that could have been withheld. The feast acknowledged this dependency even as it celebrated abundance. The religious interpretive framework extended to understanding agricultural failure. A poor harvest was not merely practical disaster. It was something that required explanation within a cosmological narrative. It might be understood as punishment for sin, the community's collective transgression had provoked divine withdrawal of blessing. Or it might be a test of faith, an opportunity for spiritual growth through endurance of hardship. Or it might be simply the inscrutable will of God, incomprehensible to human understanding, but accepted through faith. These interpretive frameworks didn't eliminate suffering, but they provided meaning that pure material failure couldn't offer. Hardship could be integrated into narrative, and narrative provided psychological resources that pure suffering did not. Local religious practice varied considerably. Different regions venerated different saints, often saints associated with particular concerns. Street Agatha for protection against fire, Street Sebastian for protection against plague, Street Barbara for protection against thunder and lightning. Local shrines or holy wells became destinations for pilgrimage during particular seasons or for particular needs. A sick child might be brought to a shrine. Someone facing a difficult decision might seek the intercession of a local saint. These practices coexisted with official church teachings, sometimes inconsistently, but they were integral to how most people understood and navigated their religious lives. The physical expressions of faith permeated daily existence. A laborer made the sign of the cross before beginning work. A mother made the sign over a child before sending them out. A meal began with spoken grace. Prayers marked moments throughout the day, upon waking, before eating, before sleep. Religious images, if the household could afford them, hung in homes. Reliquaries or amulets were worn. The sacred and the mundane were not separated, but woven together, each making the other meaningful. Beyond the official church calendar, common people maintained older beliefs and practices, folk traditions, that existed alongside or intertwined with Orthodox religion. Beneath the crucifix hung herbs gathered at midnight, prayers to saints mingled with older words, and the boundary between faith and magic blurred like mist at dawn. Christianity had come to Europe centuries before, transforming landscapes and souls, yet it had not erased what came before. Instead, layer had accumulated upon layer. In the minds and practices of common people, Christian faith coexisted with older beliefs not in conscious conflict, but in intricate interweaving. A saint might be invoked in ways once reserved for a deity. A holy well might be visited with prayer that carried echoes of older propitiation. The church's calendar absorbed pagan festivals, transforming them. Samhain became All Saints' Day. Beltane's fires reappeared in different form. These were not mere surface transformations. They were genuine syncretism, the creation of something new that contained elements of both old and new. Scattered across the landscape were places that carried power independent of any church's sanctification. An ancient oak tree might hold significance. People made offerings at its base, spoke prayers or wishes into its branches, believed it could grant favor or, if disrespected, bring misfortune. Springs flowing from the earth carried their own significance, separate from whether a saint's shrine had been built beside them. Stones arranged in patterns long before anyone could remember who had arranged them held meaning and power. These places were part of the landscape before Christianity, and they persisted in popular belief after Christianity arrived. The church could rename them. This was Street, Bridget's Spring rather than the Old Spring, but the belief in their power often persisted beneath the new name. The landscape was inhabited. Fairies or spirits dwelt in certain places in the deep woods, in standing water beneath hills. These beings were not evil necessarily, but they were other, operating by different rules, possessing different interests than humans. They could help or hinder. A person who showed them respect and caution might receive assistance. Someone who offended them might face misfortune. These weren't metaphors but real beings whose existence was taken seriously. To ignore them was foolish. To propitiate them was prudent. The line between natural explanation and supernatural explanation was thin and often irrelevant. Misfortune could be both accident and spirit, caused without contradiction. Protective charms and rituals had no official church sanction, yet they were nearly universal. Certain plants hung above doors were believed to keep away malevolent spirits or influence. Salt placed at thresholds created protective boundaries. Specific actions performed at specific times, tying knots while speaking intentions, burying objects at boundaries, speaking words in particular combinations were believed to influence outcomes. A person suffering from illness might be treated by a learned healer who combined prayer with herbal remedies, bloodletting, and practices whose logic lay outside official medical theory. Yet these practitioners were sought after and valued, and people benefited from their attention whether through pharmacologically active herbs, the placebo effect, or genuine skill developed through accumulated experience. Knowledge of folk practices was transmitted primarily through oral tradition, carried especially by women who specialized in healing, midwifery, bone setting, or herbalism. These practitioners occupied an ambiguous social space. They were valued and sought after for their skills. A woman known to have healing knowledge or the ability to assist at difficult births was crucial to her community. Yet they were also viewed with suspicion, particularly in times of misfortune. If a child died after receiving a healer's care, if livestock sickened, if crops failed after a particular woman's involvement, suspicion could attach to her. During periods of witchcraft, panic recurring crises when communities sought explanation for disaster by identifying witches, such practitioners were particularly vulnerable. The line between respected healer and suspected witch could be crossed with terrifying speed. Yet these belief systems were not superstition in any dismissive sense. They represented genuine attempts to understand a world that often seemed incomprehensible and to exert some control over forces that could destroy everything. Weather, illness, fortune, the mysterious success or failure of crops or animals, these were beyond human control. But perhaps they could be influenced through proper understanding, through right relationship with the forces and beings that inhabited one's world. Perhaps by knowing the old words, performing the right actions, offering appropriate respect, one could tilt probability in favorable directions. This wasn't certainty. Certainty was impossible, but possibility, which was better than helplessness. These belief systems didn't exist only in individual or family practice. They were reinforced and transmitted through community gatherings and celebrations. For one day, perhaps two, the wheel of labor stopped turning, and in that suspension, community breathed, danced, remembered what it meant to be human, beyond mere survival. Scattered throughout the year were days when ordinary time ceased. A saint's feast day, a harvest festival, Midsummer Eve, Christmas, Easter. These were moments when the relentless cycle of work fractured, when communities gathered not for labor but for celebration. These festivals served purposes that transcended simple religious observance. They were pressure valves, time markers, social glue, psychological necessity. In a life of unrelenting labor and constraint, festivals were the counterweight. The transformation that occurred on festival days was visible and felt. The village square or common space, ordinary on most days, became something else. People emerged wearing their best clothing, which might mean only that it was the least patched or the least soiled, but it meant effort at presentation, at marking the occasion's significance. Those who possessed anything approaching fine dress wore it. Jewelry, if the household possessed any, was displayed. The visual landscape changed. Ordinary drabness gave way to whatever colour and adornment people could muster. Food appeared that never appeared on ordinary days. A cow or pig might be slaughtered specifically for the festival. Bread was baked in quantities larger than usual. Cheese and butter, saved and carefully rationed, were brought out. Where access existed, ale or mead was drunk in quantities unusual for most days. In prosperous years or wealthy communities, honey cakes appeared. The smell of food being prepared became part of the festival experience, and the abundance itself was declaration that this day was different, that survival and sufficiency had been achieved, that celebration was possible. The activities were diverse. Religious services occurred, certainly, but alongside and after religious observance came other forms of gathering. Musicians played whoever in the community had skill or instruments. Someone with a drum, someone with pipes, someone with a simple stringed instrument. People danced, often in communal forms where participation didn't require skill. Contests of strength might occur. Wrestling, races, the lifting or throwing of heavy objects. Storytelling might happen, tales told and retold that carried entertainment and moral instruction. And through much of it, drinking continued, transforming inhibitions and creating the particular looseness that accompanied alcohol. One of festival's most significant functions was the temporary suspension of ordinary hierarchy. The master and the servant might dance together. The rich and the poor shared food and drink. Social roles, which were rigid and enforced on ordinary days, became momentarily more fluid. This created opportunity for behaviors impossible under normal circumstances. Social criticism could be expressed through satirical songs or performances, mocking authority in ways that would be dangerous on ordinary days. Romantic or sexual connections might form, spanning normally rigid social boundaries. This looseness created both joy and complication. Encounters during festivals sometimes led to forced marriages or to children born 9 months later to unmarried mothers, adding complexity to lives already difficult. The darker aspects of festival were real. Increased drinking led to increased violence. Tensions that had accumulated through months of close living and hard labor could erupt during the loosening that festival permitted. Quarrels between families or individuals sometimes turned violent. What might on ordinary days be resolved through hierarchy and threat could on festival days become physical. Women were sometimes sexually coerced or assaulted by men, emboldened by drink and temporary loosening of control. These were not celebrated or defended, they were recognized as unfortunate, but perhaps inevitable aspects of festivals' freedom. Yet despite, or perhaps including these complications, festivals served essential psychological functions. They demonstrated that life contained moments beyond mere survival. They created memories that would be recalled through months of unrelenting labor. I danced. I heard music. I ate food I rarely taste. I laughed with people I work alongside. These memories were sustenance of a different kind, reminding people that they were more than workers, that joy was possible, that community meant something beyond shared obligation. The return to ordinary life came swiftly. The next day brought return to labor, to hierarchy, to rationing. Hangovers and regrets mingled with the afterglow of festival joy. Yet something had shifted, subtly. The community had gathered and danced together. Everyone had witnessed everyone else in celebration. The bonds renewed and reinforced through festival would hold through the coming months of hardship. Having explored how belief and community sustained people, we turn finally to examine the end of the individual journey, how people faced illness, aging, and death. The hands that had worked for decades grew uncertain. The eyes that had read field and sky grew dim, and with each diminishment came the question, what worth remains when strength departs? Aging in a subsistence economy was a particular kind of precariousness. Strength was currency. The capacity to labor determined social position and economic security. As strength diminished gradually, then more noticeably, a person's fundamental value shifted. This was not sentimentality, but fact. An old person who could not work was an additional mouth requiring feeding, additional body requiring care, in a context where resources were never abundant. And yet elders were also repositories of knowledge, memory, and tradition. They could teach, they could advise, they could tend children, or perform lighter tasks. The question of how an aging person was valued depended on complex calculations: the family's available resources, the elders' past relationships, their ability to perform some useful function. Sometimes simple luck regarding who else in the household remained capable of carrying labor. The physical experience of aging was gradual erosion. Strength that had been reliable for decades began to fail. Tasks performed thousands of times became difficult. The body, marked by years of labor-calloused hands, scarred skin, muscles shaped by repetitive motion, began to betray its owner. A woman who had carried water for 50 years might find the buckets suddenly too heavy. A man who had plowed fields his entire adult life might discover his back wouldn't permit the motion. These weren't dramatic failures, but steady, inexorable diminishment. Vision deteriorated. Work requiring precision fine needlework, carving, detailed repair work became impossible. For someone whose identity had been shaped by skilled work, this was a significant loss. The eyes that had read weather in the sky, that had recognized disease in animals, that had judged ripeness in crops, those same eyes began to fail. Prescription lenses did not exist. Accepting diminished vision meant accepting a narrowed world. Teeth were lost. One by one, or sometimes suddenly after infection or injury, teeth departed. This was more than cosmetic. Teeth enabled the eating of hard foods, nuts, grains that hadn't been ground fine, dried meat. As teeth disappeared, diet shifted. Food had to be softer, often requiring more cooking or preparation. This meant both the elder required more assistance in food preparation, and that their diet became less nutritious, more limited. Gums toughened, and adaptation occurred, but something real was lost. Cold became dangerous in ways it hadn't been when the body generated abundant heat through labor. An old person sitting relatively still, no longer producing the warmth of physical work, was colder than the same person had been at 20 or 30. Winter became more difficult. Illness struck more easily and lasted longer. Pneumonia, influenza, simple infection from a cut or wound. These could be deadly to an old person whose body was already diminished. The family's response to aging members varied tremendously. In some households, the elder was genuinely valued, respected, given the best food available, cared for with tenderness, born from familial affection or recognition of the elder's earlier caregiving. In such households, the elder might sit near the fire, mind children, dispense advice, and feel themselves still part of the household's functioning. In other households, the elder was a burden, viewed with resentment or impatience. Food was rationed more carefully for the old person. They were isolated or neglected. The elder's life was made unpleasant, not through deliberate cruelty, but through the logical prioritization of those still capable of labor. Elders navigated this transition in different ways. Some adapted, finding satisfaction in lighter roles, teaching, advising, storytelling, childcare. Their identity shifted from worker to elder, and they found meaning in this new role. Others struggled with the loss. The person whose entire life had been defined by labor might feel their identity fragmenting as labor became impossible. Who was one, if not a worker? What worth remained? The security of old age depended entirely on family. An elder with strong family bonds, with children or relatives willing and able to provide care, might face aging with relative security. An elder alone, without family or with family too poor or too burdened to provide care, faced genuine danger. Death might come from deliberate abandonment, but more commonly it came from simple neglect, in a society that had no institutional framework for caring for the unsupported elderly. This reality shaped relationships. An elder who sensed their family's resentment faced anxiety not merely about hardship, but about whether they would be abandoned. When an elder died, something irreplaceable departed. The stories they had carried, the skills they had embodied, the memory they held of earlier times, all of this was lost. Knowledge that had seemed to exist in tradition was sometimes revealed to exist in only one person, and that person was gone. The household carried forward, but it carried forward diminished. Aging eventually gives way to illness, injury, or simply the body's final exhaustion, confronting individuals and families with the reality of death. Death was not distant eventuality, but close neighbor, its presence lending urgency to prayers, weight to grudges, sweetness to each ordinary morning survived. In modern industrialized life, death is often hidden. It occurs in hospitals or hospices, removed from the everyday spaces where people live. Bodies are handled by professionals. The dying and the dead are removed from the sight of those continuing to live. But in an earlier time, death was present. It lived in the same spaces where life occurred. A child might die in the same bed where their siblings slept. A woman might lose consciousness during childbirth and never regain it, expiring in the same room where the family ate. An old person might take weeks to die, their slow decline visible to everyone in the household. Most people had witnessed death multiple times before their own came. An infant stillborn or dying in infancy was common enough that grief, while real, was expected, and brief sorrow mingled with something approaching resignation. Children died from simple infections, from accidents, from illnesses that couldn't be treated. Young adults died from childbirth complications, from infections following wounds, from accidents in the fields or while traveling. The middle-aged died from the accumulated damage of years of labor. The elderly died from the final failing of an already weakened body. Death was not exceptional. It was regular, predictable in its unpredictability. A deathbed scene, when it occurred, typically happened at home. A person fell ill or grew weaker. Family gathered, each attending to their own tasks, caring for children, preparing food, maintaining the household's necessary functions while paying attention to the dying person. If one could be summoned, a priest might come to offer last rites, to hear confession, to offer prayers. But a priest was not always available, and many deaths occurred without this formal religious attendance. The person lay on whatever sleeping surface they normally occupied: a straw mattress, a bed frame if the family possessed one. As death approached, consciousness often fragmented. The person might speak in delirium, calling to people long dead, their words nonsensical or profound, depending on one's interpretation. The family listened. They spoke to the dying person, sometimes prayers, sometimes practical reminders or reassurances, though the dying often seemed to occupy a space beyond these reaches. Death, when it came, might be sudden or might take hours, even days. The moment itself was often subtle. The breathing simply stopped. The body went still. Someone would notice the cessation of breath, the absence of response, and the fact would ripple through the household. The person had died. The dead person remained in the family space. The practical work of death followed immediately. The body had to be washed, a task usually performed by family members or by women neighbors who specialized in this work. The person was dressed in their best clothing or in special burial garments, if the family could manage them. Sometimes the body was placed in a coffin. Often it was simply wrapped in cloth. Religious prayers accompanied these preparations. The body might remain in the home for a day or more before burial, sometimes to allow time for distant relatives to arrive. More often, simply because this was custom. Death had to be reported. Burial arrangements had to be made permission from the church, if Christian and if formal burial was planned. Arrangements with gravediggers or burial leaders, notification of the priest. There were costs involved that the family had to manage. The body had to be transported to the grave, sometimes carried by family members, sometimes by hired bearers. The grave had to be dug. All of this was work, and it happened while the household continued. Other children still required care. Meals still needed preparation. Other family members might still be working in fields or attending to outside tasks. Mourning followed formal patterns that varied by region and religion. Black or dark clothing was worn for specified periods. Certain activities were restricted: no celebrations, no music in some traditions, no heavy labor for women in some customs. Prayers were spoken regularly. In Christian contexts, masses might be said for the dead person's soul. The dead person's name was spoken, their memory maintained through stories and recollection. Yet mourning occurred against the backdrop of continuing life. The household needed to function. If the person who died had been a primary worker, their absence created immediate crisis. If they had been an elder or a child, the impact was different, but still real. The grief was genuine, but it existed alongside the practical necessity of continuation. The consciousness of death's nearness shaped how people lived. Prayer and religious devotion were not abstract practices, but responses to the reality that one might die at any moment. Grudges seemed less important when death could arrive without warning. Small kindnesses mattered because they might be the last interaction before departure. The world was not separate into life and death, but seen as a single reality where death was always present, always possible. After death, the living must continue carrying grief, adjusting to absence, and eventually integrating loss into the ongoing rhythm of life. The absent place at the table eventually filled with another, not replacing, never forgetting, but accommodating loss into the endless pattern of days, as morning accommodates the absence of stars. The work of living could not stop for grief. A household that had lost a crucial worker faced immediate crisis. If a father died during planting season, the fields still required ploughing. If a mother died during harvest, the grain still required preservation. The loss was both emotional and economic, and the economic crisis often demanded attention that prevented full engagement with emotional devastation. The household reorganized. An eldest son might assume his father's role and authority, sometimes with resentment from younger siblings or widow. A widow might remarry, sometimes out of genuine affection but often out of economic necessity. She needed a man's labor and legal standing to survive. Children might be sent to relatives if the household could not absorb them. Young children might be apprenticed early to relatives or community members, their labor contributing to another household while reducing the burden on their own. When a mother died, alternative arrangements had to be made. A grandmother might step in if one was alive and capable. A sister or aunt might move into the household. In some cases, the father remarried, and a stepmother arrived to assume household management. The dead woman's possessions, her clothing, any tools specific to her work. Perhaps items of particular value or sentiment might be distributed among female relatives, or kept for daughters to inherit. The role shifted, the person shifted, but the labor continued. The death of a child created different pressures. Grief was real and could be profound, yet there was sometimes an unspoken relief, one less mouth to feed during times of scarcity. This contradiction existed, and people navigated it with whatever emotional complexity they could manage. Grief and relief could coexist without negating each other. The child would be mourned, but the household also carried forward with one less dependent. Yet the dead did not truly disappear. They remained present through memory, through story, through the continuation of their work by others. A child named after a deceased sibling or parent carried that person forward in name and in some sense in identity. The land continued to be worked where the dead had worked it. Crafts continued to be practiced. Recipes and techniques were transmitted. This was how so-and-so made bread, or how one prepared a particular herb. The dead were present in the doing of things. Communities supported their bereaved, not through formal counseling, but through continued inclusion and practical assistance. A widow in need of heavy work might have neighbors who helped with repairs or field work. Children of the dead might be invited to eat with relatives. The bereaved person was still part of the community. They continued to participate in labor, in festivals, in religious observances. Their grief was acknowledged. People knew they had suffered loss, but they were not isolated by that loss. The dead were commemorated through religious and seasonal observances. All Souls' Day or similar occasions throughout the Christian year provided opportunity to remember the dead specifically, to pray for their souls, to speak their names. In some contexts, families visited graves and left flowers or other tokens. The dead were not forgotten, but regularly brought back into active remembrance. They remained part of the community's ongoing story, their lives continuing to matter through memory. Religious belief provided frameworks for understanding death that made continuation possible. Death was not annihilation, but transition. The person had departed this world, but continued in another realm. They might eventually reunite with those they had loved. They might intercede with God or the saints for those still living. Prayer could benefit the dead, and the dead might watch over the living. This theology transformed grief from despair into a different kind of relationship, changed, but not severed. Yet the pain was real, and sometimes unresolved. Not all grief was integrated smoothly. Some losses, particularly of children or young adults with their lives still ahead, left permanent wounds. Mothers who lost children sometimes carried lifelong sadness. The pressure to continue functioning meant that some grief found no outlet, suppressed beneath the necessity of ongoing work. This suppressed grief might emerge at unexpected moments, a sound, a season, a task the dead person would have done triggering sudden tears, or a moment of absence. This was understood as normal, something that happened, part of the human landscape of loss. Yet continuation itself was the ultimate response to loss. Individual lives ended, but the patterns persisted. The seasons turned. Spring brought planting again. Summer brought growth and harvest. Autumn brought preservation. Winter brought rest. The work the dead had done was taken up by others. Children grew and learned, and eventually taught their own children. The great cycle continued, and each person participated in it knowing their time was limited, their contribution ultimately small against the vast ongoing pattern, yet real and necessary nonetheless. We began this journey at dawn, following an ordinary person through an ordinary day. We have traced the cycles that shaped that day, the seasons that determined what work was possible, the beliefs that gave meaning to labor, the communities that held individuals within their bonds, the families that sustained life through generations. We have watched as that ordinary person aged, as they faced the same struggles and small joys that shaped all human lives in times and places far from our own. And now we return, having completed the circle, knowing that another dawn will arrive, another person will wake to the endless, ordinary work of being human, continuing the vast and humble story that history itself is written upon. All the lives we've imagined, all the hands that worked and hearts that worried, all have returned to dust. Yet the pattern remains. Waking, working, sleeping, the eternal rhythm that cradles us still. We began this journey in a single household, following one ordinary person through the ordinary acts of an ordinary day. From there, we expanded outward and inward outward to the seasons and cycles that structured entire lives, inward to the beliefs and fears and small joys that gave meaning to repetitive labor. We traced the arc of a human life. Childhood absorbed into work, adulthood defined by it, old age marked by its withdrawal, death returning the body to the earth. And now, at the journey's end, let us step back further, still far enough, to see not one life, but millions. Not one day, but centuries. Not one story, but the vast, incomprehensible vastness of human experience stretching behind us and around us. Consider the scale for a moment. In medieval Europe alone, millions of people lived and died. Each was born, each experienced hunger and cold, joy and loss, hope and fear. Each faced the particular challenges of their moment, the specific constraints and possibilities their world offered. Each worked and loved and worried and eventually lay down and died. And this was true not just of Europe, but of every inhabited place, Asia with its vast populations, Africa with its diverse peoples, the Americas with their indigenous societies. Across all these places and times, countless billions of human beings lived their single, irreplaceable lives. The scale is so immense that the mind struggles to comprehend it. We cannot actually imagine a billion lives, or even a million. We can only imagine one, and multiply infinitely in abstract recognition that one was repeated endlessly. What strikes us, as we contemplate this scale, is a paradox. We cannot truly know what it was like to be a medieval peasant or an early modern craftsperson. We cannot access the precise felt experience of their hunger, their fatigue, their particular fears and hopes. Too much has changed. We do not live as they did. We cannot fully step into their minds or bodies or worlds, and yet, and this is what draws us to this contemplation in imagining their lives, we recognize something we share: the need for food, the desire for warmth and safety, the love of small comforts and kindnesses, the capacity for both cruelty and tenderness, the search for significance, for meaning, for some way to understand why we labor and suffer and love. These are not medieval concerns or modern concerns, they are human concerns, present across the vast span of our existence. In learning to imagine their daily lives, we discover continuities that run beneath all the changes of history. The specific forms shift. We no longer spin wool by hand, most of us, or fear witches, or organize time by saints' days, but the underlying patterns persist. We still wake and work and eat and rest. We still fear loss and hunger, still seek connection and meaning, still struggle against the body's limitations and time's flow. We still gather in communities and mark passages through ritual. We still face death, still grieve, still continue. In this sense, the history we've traced is not foreign to us, but familiar, a variation on the same human themes that still structure our own lives. Yet it would be false to suggest nothing has changed, that we merely replay an eternal pattern. Much has been lost. Structures of meaning that sustained people for centuries have dissolved. Rhythms of life tied to natural cycles have been overwritten by mechanical time. Relationships to land, to community, to the sacred, these have been transformed almost beyond recognition. Ways of being that felt natural and inevitable to millions of people have become incomprehensible to us. Something has been genuinely lost in this transformation, something we cannot fully recover even if we wanted to. This loss deserves acknowledgement and even mourning. And yet, and this is important, much has also been gained. Fewer infants die before reaching adulthood. Food is abundant rather than scarce for many people in many places, freed from the constant danger of famine. The grinding physical labor that exhausted bodies across centuries has been substantially reduced. Possibilities for individual development, education, and self-determination have expanded for many. Diseases that killed regularly now rarely strike. Pain that was endured for lack of remedy can now be addressed. The transformation that destroyed old structures of meaning also opened possibilities that previous generations could barely imagine. This is not redemptive. The gains do not negate the losses, but it is true, and it complicates any simple nostalgia for the past. So we stand in this complex space, recognizing what was lost, while acknowledging what was gained, valuing the lives that were lived then, while being grateful for aspects of our own existence. This is the honest position, the one that respects both past and present without collapsing them into each other. And now, as we reflect on these historical lives, let us turn the gaze inward toward your own life, the one you are living now, in whatever moment you inhabit. What routines structure your days? What labor occupies your hands and mind? What communities hold you, even if they seem fragmented compared to earlier forms? What beliefs sustain you, whether religious or secular, whether spoken or unexamined? What small rituals mark your days? What relationships matter to you? What fears do you carry? What work seems meaningless, and what work feels significant? These are the questions that connected us to the lives we've imagined. They are also the questions that will shape how historians in some distant future try to understand our lives. They will wonder at our daily preoccupations, the technologies we cannot imagine living without, the particular ways we structure time and relationship. They will try to understand how we lived, what mattered to us, what we feared and hoped for. What seems obvious and eternal to us will seem strange and exotic to them, a peculiar arrangement that existed for a time before changing into something else. And this awareness that future people will examine our lives with the same curiosity we've applied to the past can be oddly liberating. Your daily life, with all its routines and repetitions, its seeming ordinariness and lack of drama, is actually the substance of history. You are living the history that will be studied. The specific way you spend your time, the particular concerns that occupy your mind, the technologies you depend on, the relationships you maintain, all of this will be the raw material for future understanding, future puzzlement, future attempts at empathy across time. This brings us to the concept of boring, the word in our journey's title. What we call boring, the repetitive, the ordinary, the unglamorous, actually constitutes the vast majority of human experience. The dramatic events that fill history books and capture attention occupied tiny fractions of time. Most of human existence was then and remains now the daily round, waking, working, eating, relating, tending to necessities, sleeping. Kings and peasants, rich and poor, brilliant and ordinary, all spent most of their time engaged in these daily rounds. This is not tragedy or failure. It is simply the human condition. There is something strange and comforting in this recognition. Your ordinary life, with its routines and its repetitions, continues a pattern as old as humanity itself. You are not outside of history, but embedded in it, participating in the eternal rhythm, that has shaped all human lives. And now, as we approach the end of this journey together, notice how the hour has grown late. The sun has set. The household settles. Work ends. The body grows heavier, more inclined toward rest. The mind, occupied for so long with stories and images, begins to slow. And the universal human experience that spans all centuries and all places, the approach of sleep, draws near. Across all of time, in all places, people have lain down in darkness. Peasants and kings, rich and poor, the celebrated and the forgotten, all have surrendered to sleep. Sleep is perhaps the most profoundly democratic of human experiences. In sleep, all the distinctions that divide us fade. Status means nothing. Wealth provides no advantage. Intelligence offers no protection. We are all equally vulnerable, all equally subject to the body's need for rest, all equally unable to control the dreams that come unbidden. We lie down and release the day's concerns. We close our eyes on the visible world. We surrender consciousness and allow ourselves to drift into the mysterious country where time flows differently and logic dissolves. The darkness gathers around us now. Feel it not as something to fear, but as something natural, inevitable, as old as consciousness itself. Across all the centuries we've traced, people have welcomed this darkness, have sought it, have allowed it to carry them into rest. The day's work is done. The stories have been told. The images we've constructed together begin to fade like mist. You need not hold them anymore. You need not try to remember or understand or integrate. Let them go. History will continue without your attention. The past remains patient, inexhaustible, waiting. It will be there when you wake. Sleep now can come without resistance. The candle burns lower. The flame flickers slightly, responding to imperceptible drafts of air. Then it steadies. The wax beneath continues its slow transformation from solid to liquid to smoke and air. The light that seemed so substantial a moment ago is temporary, dependent on forces beyond its own control. And then gently, without drama, without announcement, the flame goes out. There is only darkness now, and the sound of breathing, and the soft weight of rest descending. All the lives we've imagined, all the hands that worked and hearts that worried, all have returned to dust. And in this returning, they have joined the infinite pattern of human beings before us and after us, all waking and working and sleeping, all participating in the great rhythm that moves through time, carrying each of us for our small moment before releasing us again. Release now comes. Let the images fade. Let the stories settle. Let the mind grow quiet. There is nothing more to do, nowhere else to go. Only the darkness now, and the breath, and the body's honest need for rest. And in the darkness, as always, people slept.